They called them foolish, reckless, even senile when they spent their last $12,000 on a crumbling forest house everyone said was cursed. But what this mocked elderly couple found hidden beneath those rotting floorboards wasn't just a fortune worth $250 million. It was proof that sometimes the people who laugh the loudest are the ones who understand the least. Before we dive into this incredible true story, make sure to smash subscribe because tomorrow we have an extra special story for you that will blow your mind. The mountain town of Pine Ridge, North Carolina, population 3,217, had exactly three things people agreed on. The water from the old wells tasted like iron and memory. The winters came early and stayed late like unwelcome relatives, and nobody in their right mind would ever buy the Blackwood property. It sat 5 miles up a winding dirt road that turned to mud in spring and ice in winter, swallowed by 40 years of wild forest growth, hidden behind walls of mountain laurel and ancient hemlock so thick you could barely see the roofline even when you knew where to look. The house itself looked like something pulled from a nightmare or a fever dream, depending on who you asked. Strange angles that made no architectural sense. Windows placed at odd heights, some too high to reach, others too low to be practical. A stone tower rising from the east side that served no purpose anyone could figure out, topped with a rusted weather vane frozen permanently pointing northeast as if it had given up trying to find the wind decades ago. Local teenagers, the ones brave enough or foolish enough, said the place was haunted by the ghost of Frederick Blackwood, the eccentric millionaire who'd built it back in the 60s and then vanished without a trace in 1979. They'd dare each other to walk up the overgrown driveway at midnight, but nobody ever made it past the iron gate. Adults, the practical folk who ran Murphy's General Store and worked at the lumber mill and taught at Pine Ridge Elementary, just said the place was a lawsuit waiting to happen. Foundation cracked, roof sagging, probably full of black mold and asbestos and God knows what else. A money pit, a fool's errand, a waste of perfectly good land. Harold and Margaret Sullivan had heard every warning, every rumor, every piece of well-meaning advice. They'd lived in Pine Ridge for 43 years, raised their daughter Sarah in a modest ranch house on Cedar Street, the kind of place with vinyl siding and a chain-link fence and a yard that Harold kept mowed to exactly 3 inches every Saturday morning from April through October. They knew every person in town by name, knew who attended First Baptist and who went to the Methodist Church on the hill, knew whose kids were trouble and whose were heading to college, knew which families were holding on and which were barely hanging on. They were part of the fabric of Pine Ridge, woven in so tight that most folks forgot they'd ever come from somewhere else. Harold, 72 years old that autumn, had worked as a carpenter his whole adult life. His hands told the story better than words ever could, thick fingers gnarled by arthritis, knuckles swollen and stiff on cold mornings, calluses built up over 50 years of gripping hammers and saws and sandpaper. His palms were mapped with scars, each one a memory. The jagged line across his left thumb from when he'd been 23 and careless with a chisel. The burn mark on his right wrist from a soldering iron that had slipped when he was 40. The deep groove near his pinky from a table saw that had caught wrong when he was 58. The accident that had finally convinced him maybe it was time to slow down. He'd built cabinets and bookshelves and entire room additions for half the houses in Pine Ridge. Had framed the new wing at the elementary school in '87, had restored the altar at First Baptist after the flood of '93. His work was everywhere in that town, solid and true, and built to last long after he was gone. Margaret, 70 years old and still sharp as the sewing needles she'd spent a lifetime threading, had been a seamstress since she was 16. She'd learned from her grandmother, a woman who could look at fabric and see the dress it wanted to become, who could take measurements with her eyes and cut patterns without paper. Margaret had that same gift, that ability to see potential in raw materials. She'd sewn wedding dresses for 3 generations of Pine Ridge brides, prom dresses for nervous teenagers, baptism gowns for babies whose parents couldn't afford store-bought. She'd altered suits for funerals and hemmed pants for men who'd gained or lost weight over the years. Her sewing room in the house on Cedar Street was small but organized, spools of thread arranged by color, patterns filed by decade, her ancient Singer machine that she'd bought secondhand in 1971 still running smooth as the day it was made. Her eyes were still sharp behind reading glasses she'd bought at the dollar store, held together now with electrical tape after Sarah's youngest had sat on them last Christmas. They weren't rich. They'd never been rich. The house on Cedar Street had been paid off 15 years ago, a mortgage that had taken 30 years to clear. Their retirement fund consisted of Social Security checks that came like clockwork on the 3rd of every month, a small savings account at Pine Ridge Credit Union that had taken 3 decades to build to $14,000, and Harold's old truck that he'd bought used in 2003. They shopped at Murphy's when things were on sale, bought their clothes at the Goodwill in the next town over, cut coupons from the Sunday paper even though Margaret's hands cramped now when she worked the scissors too long. They weren't poor exactly, not by Pine Ridge standards where plenty of folks were worse off, but they weren't comfortable either. Every month was a careful dance of bills and groceries and medications, of deciding whether they could afford to run the heat a little higher or if they should just wear another sweater. But they were happy. That was the thing people who had more money never seemed to understand. Harold and Margaret were happy. They had each other. They had Sarah, who lived an hour away in Asheville with her husband Tom and their 2 kids. They had Sunday dinners and quiet evenings on the porch and the satisfaction that came from a life lived with integrity and purpose. They had enough. Until the house on Cedar Street started falling apart. It started with the roof. A leak above the guest bedroom that Harold patched 3 times before admitting the whole thing needed replacing. $8,000 the contractor quoted them. Then the furnace died in January, right in the middle of a cold snap that sent temperatures down to 15 degrees. Another $4,000 for a new one. The water heater went in March. The foundation started showing cracks in April. By the time summer rolled around, they'd spent $11,000 of their savings, and the house still wasn't right. The plumbing groaned, the electrical flickered. The floors had developed a sag in the hallway that made Margaret nervous every time she walked over it. They'd lived in that house for 43 years. Brought Sarah home from the hospital to that house. Celebrated every Christmas and birthday and anniversary in that house. Harold had built the deck out back by hand, every board carefully measured and sanded and sealed. Margaret had planted the rose bushes that climbed the trellis by the front door, pruned them every spring, watched them bloom every June. That house held every memory they'd made together since 1981, but it was dying, and they couldn't afford to save it. The decision to sell came on a humid evening in late July. They'd sat on that deck Harold had built, drinking sweet tea gone lukewarm, listening to cicadas sing their desperate summer songs. The realtor had come by that afternoon, walked through every room with a practiced eye, and delivered the news gently but firmly. In its current condition, the house might sell for $90,000, maybe $100 if they got lucky. After the remaining repairs were made, and they'd have to make them, no bank would mortgage a house with foundation issues. They'd be lucky to clear $70,000, enough to buy something smaller. A manufactured home, maybe. One of those retirement communities over in Hendersonville where the units were stacked close together and the HOA fees ate up half your Social Security. Margaret had cried that night, quietly, her face turned toward the rose bushes so Harold wouldn't see. But he'd seen anyway. Had wrapped his arm around her shoulders that were thinner now than they used to be, more fragile, and held her while the darkness gathered around them. "We'll figure something out," he'd said, because that's what he always said. That's what he'd been saying for 50 years of marriage, through job losses and sick parents and every hard thing life had thrown at them. "We'll figure something out." And somehow they always had. That autumn morning when Harold saw the auction notice pinned to the community board outside the post office, something stirred in his chest, something he hadn't felt in years. Not hope exactly, more like curiosity. The kind of curiosity that had gotten him in trouble when he was young. that had made him take apart his father's radio when he was 8 just to see how it worked, that had convinced him to marry Margaret when everyone said they were too young and too poor and too foolish. The notice was printed on pale yellow paper, the edges curling from humidity and age. Estate auction, forest property, 5 acres, structure included. Saturday, October 15th, 10 o'clock a.m. Pine Ridge Town Hall. Starting bid $8,000. Cash or certified check only. Serious inquiries only. Property sold as is. All sales final. Below the text was a photograph, faded and grainy like it had been photocopied too many times. A house, if you could call it that, rising from dense forest. Even in the poor quality image, you could see the strangeness of it, the odd angles, the mismatched windows, that tower reaching toward the sky like a finger pointing at God. Harold stared at that notice for a long time, long enough that Martha Henderson came out of the post office and asked if he was feeling all right, long enough that the autumn sun shifted and his shadow moved across the bulletin board, long enough that he knew, deep in his bones where knowledge lived before it became words, that he was going to buy that house. Margaret had been beside him, her hand wrapped around his elbow the way it had been since 1972 when they'd married in a church that no longer existed, torn down to make way for a Dollar General. Her grip was still strong despite the arthritis, still steady. She'd been collecting their mail, a stack of bills and grocery store circulars, and a postcard from Sarah, who was on vacation with the family in Myrtle Beach. She'd glanced at the board, seen what Harold was staring at, and gone very still. Harold Sullivan, she'd said quietly, and he'd heard everything in those 2 words. The question, the concern, the knowledge that when Harold got that look on his face, that far-away expression like he was seeing something nobody else could see, there was no talking him out of whatever fool notion had taken root in his mind. "What are you thinking?" she'd asked, though she already knew. Harold didn't answer right away. He just kept staring at that notice, at the faded photograph of a house that looked more like a puzzle than a home, more like a challenge than a dwelling. His mind was already working, already calculating. They had $14,000 in savings. The auction started at $8,000. If it went much higher, they'd be priced out. But what if it didn't? What if nobody else wanted it? What if they could buy 5 acres and a house, strange as it was, for less than it would cost to fix the foundation on Cedar Street? What if this was the answer they'd been looking for, the solution that would let them keep their dignity and their independence instead of ending up in some cookie-cutter retirement community where every unit looked the same and you couldn't plant roses because they violated the landscaping covenant? "I'm thinking," he finally said, his voice rough like it got when emotion was sitting heavy in his throat, "that we've got 14,000 saved, and maybe it's time we stopped being careful." Margaret had laughed then, the kind of laugh that came from deep in the belly, from years of loving a man whose quiet nature hid a stubborn streak that ran wider and deeper than the Pigeon River that cut through the valley below Pine Ridge. It was the laugh she'd given when he'd proposed with a ring he'd made himself from copper wire because he couldn't afford gold. The laugh she'd given when he'd announced he was quitting his job at the mill to start his own carpentry business with nothing but a toolbox and faith. The laugh that meant she thought he was crazy but she loved him anyway, and where he went, she'd follow. "Harold Sullivan," she'd said again, but this time there was warmth in it, affection worn smooth by decades of use. "Are you telling me you want to buy the Blackwood place?" "I'm saying I want to look at it," he'd replied, but they both knew looking would turn into buying. It always did with Harold. When he saw a project, saw something broken that he believed he could fix, he couldn't let it go. It was who he was, who he'd always been. A man who saw potential where others saw problems. A man who believed anything worth having was worth working for. A man who'd built a life and a marriage and a reputation on the simple principle that broken things deserved a second chance. The auction was held on a Tuesday afternoon in the basement of Pine Ridge Town Hall, a squat brick building that also housed the police department, the volunteer fire station, and the public library. Fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like trapped insects, casting a greenish glow that made everyone look slightly ill. Metal folding chairs were arranged in crooked rows facing a podium where Davis Reeves stood shuffling papers. Davis was thin as wire and looked like he'd been assembled from spare parts, all angles and joints, wrapped in a denim jacket 2 sizes too big that had probably belonged to his father. His voice came out like gravel being shaken in a coffee can, rough and uneven but persistent. Maybe 15 people had shown up, and Harold recognized all of them. Martha Henderson from the post office, probably just curious. Buck Wilson and his brother Dale, who bought foreclosed properties and flipped them, though they'd never tackled anything as ambitious as the Blackwood place. A woman named Sherry something or other, who'd moved to Pine Ridge a few years back and ran some kind of online business nobody quite understood. A handful of other folks, retirees mostly, who came to every auction because it was free entertainment and beat watching daytime television. Harold and Margaret sat in the back row, Margaret's purse clutched in her lap containing a checkbook she'd already filled out for $12,000, her hand shaking slightly as she'd written the numbers, leaving their account with exactly $2,000 to their name. Everything they had, their entire safety net, written out in blue ink on a check that felt like it weighed 100 pounds. Davis Reeves called the auction to order at 10 minutes past 10, apologizing for the delay without explaining what had caused it. He read through the legal description of the property, lot numbers and survey coordinates that meant nothing to Harold but everything to a lawyer. 5.3 acres, zoned residential, no liens, no back taxes owed, surprisingly. Structure included as is, no warranties expressed or implied. Buyer assumes all responsibility for inspection and repairs. Possession upon payment. All sales final. The usual warnings about not holding the county responsible for anything, injuries, deaths, acts of God, or structural collapse. Harold had heard it all before at other auctions. It was standard language designed to protect lawyers and frighten buyers. It didn't frighten him. He'd spent 50 years working with his hands, taking calculated risks, trusting his judgment. This was just another project. A bigger project, sure. Maybe the biggest he'd ever attempted, but still just wood and stone and problems that could be solved with time and effort and skill. Davis started the bidding at $8,000. Silence settled over the basement like dust, thick and heavy. People shifted in their seats, the metal chairs squeaking and groaning. Someone coughed into their hand. Outside, Harold could hear traffic passing on Main Street, normal sounds of a normal day for people who weren't about to make the biggest gamble of their lives. Davis tried again, his voice rising slightly. Come on, folks. $8,000 for 5 acres of mountain land with a standing structure. Location alone is worth twice that. Somebody's got to want this. More silence. Buck Wilson whispered something to his brother Dale, shook his head. Sherry, what's-her-name, was scrolling through her phone, clearly not interested. Martha Henderson was examining her fingernails like they held secrets she'd just discovered. Davis dropped the price. All right, let's start at $6,000 then. $6,000 for property that's been appraised at. He shuffled through his papers, found what he was looking for. At $43,000 based on land value alone. That's $6,000 for $43,000 worth of property. This is a steal, folks. Still nothing. And that's when Harold's hand went up, steady despite the trembling in his chest, despite Margaret's sharp intake of breath beside him, despite the small voice in the back of his mind that sounded suspiciously like his long-dead father saying this was foolish, reckless, irresponsible. $6,000, Harold said, his voice carrying in the fluorescent-lit basement, surprisingly strong for a man of 72 whose knees creaked when he stood up too fast and whose back ached every morning until he'd been moving for an hour. Every head in that basement turned. 14 people swiveled to stare at Harold and Margaret Sullivan, sitting in the back row like students who'd misbehaved and been sent to detention. Harold felt the weight of those stares, felt the judgment and the curiosity and the shock. Margaret heard the whispers start immediately, hissing like steam escaping from a kettle. "Is that Harold Sullivan?" Buck Wilson's voice, not even trying to be quiet. "What's he thinking?" Martha Henderson, scandalized. "That place is a death trap. Somebody should stop him." Sherry, what's-her-name, concerned in that way outsiders got when they thought locals were making mistakes. Poor things, must be going senile. An older man Harold didn't recognize, but the words stung anyway, sharp and mean. Davis Reeves had blinked, clearly surprised that anyone had bid at all, let alone Harold Sullivan, who was known around Pine Ridge as practical and careful and not the type to take wild risks. "We have $6,000, Davis said, recovering his auctioneering rhythm. "Do I hear 7,000? Silence. The kind of silence that got heavier the longer it lasted. Harold could hear his own heartbeat, could feel Margaret's hand reach over and grip his knee, could sense the entire room holding its breath, waiting for someone, anyone, to save him from himself. "Going once at 6,000, Davis called out, giving everyone a chance, giving Buck and Dale Wilson time to confer, giving anyone in that basement an opportunity to be the hero who stopped this foolish old man from wasting his retirement savings on a house everyone knew was worthless. "Going twice at $6,000. The pause stretched out, 3 seconds that felt like 3 hours. Harold closed his eyes, not sure if he was praying or just bracing for impact. "Sold." Davis brought the gavel down with a crack that sounded like breaking bone, to Harold Sullivan for $6,000. The finality of that sound, wood striking wood, echoed through the basement and seemed to reverberate through Harold's entire body. Margaret squeezed his knee so hard it hurt, but he wasn't sure if it was support or panic or maybe both at once. As they walked to the front to complete the paperwork, to hand over the check that represented everything they had, Harold was aware of every whisper, every pitying look, every shake of the head. Buck Wilson actually stopped them on the way out. "Harold, Margaret," he said, his weathered face creased with what might have been genuine concern. "You know that place is gonna need at least $50,000 in repairs just to be habitable, right? Foundations cracked, roofs shot. Probably got mold and termites and God knows what else." Harold had just nodded, tucked the deed papers under his arm. "Appreciate your concern, Buck. I'm serious, man. That place has been empty since '79. Nobody's lived there in over 40 years. There's a reason for that." "I'm sure there is," Harold said mildly. "We'll find out what it is soon enough." By the time they reached Harold's truck, a 1998 Ford F-150 that coughed like it had emphysema and burned a quart of oil every 1,000 miles, clusters of people stood on the sidewalk outside Town Hall, pretending not to watch but watching anyway. Harold could feel their eyes on him as he helped Margaret into the passenger seat, as he walked around to the driver's side, as he started the engine that turned over twice before catching with a sound like grinding metal. Martha Henderson had actually followed them out, her face flushed either from climbing the basement stairs or from the urgency of her mission. "Harold, Margaret," she called, slightly out of breath. "Are you absolutely sure about this? That place, the Blackwood property, it's been empty since Frederick Blackwood disappeared. There's a reason nobody's touched it in all these years, a reason nobody wanted it today, even at such a low price." Harold had rolled down his window, rested his arm on the door. "What reason would that be, Martha?" She'd lowered her voice, glanced around like she was sharing classified information. "People say strange things happened there. Before Blackwood vanished. Lights on at all hours, odd sounds. He was working on something he didn't want anyone to know about. Then one day he was just gone. Never found a body, never found any trace of him, just an empty house and unpaid property taxes the county finally seized." Margaret had leaned across from the passenger seat. "Sounds like ghost stories, Martha. Tales people tell because the truth is boring. Martha's expression had shifted, hardened. Well, don't say I didn't warn you. When that place collapses on you in your sleep, when you've wasted every penny you have on a house that can't be saved, remember I tried to tell you. Harold had just smiled, tired but genuine. We'll remember, Martha. Thank you. They'd driven straight to the property, Harold navigating the winding mountain roads by memory, even though he hadn't been out this way in years. The road up to the Blackwood place was worse than he remembered, rutted and overgrown, branches scraping the sides of the truck like skeletal fingers trying to hold them back. The forest had reclaimed most of the driveway, saplings growing up through what had once been gravel, weeds tall enough to brush the truck's undercarriage. When they finally rounded the last curve and the house came into view, Margaret gasped. Not from beauty, from shock, from the sheer overwhelming reality of what they'd just bought. The house loomed before them in the late afternoon light. 3 stories of weathered wood and stone, and what looked like sheer stubbornness holding it upright. The tower rose from the eastern side like a lighthouse searching for a sea that wasn't there, its peak lost in the shadows of surrounding hemlocks. Ivy and Virginia creeper had claimed most of the lower walls, thick vines that looked like they were trying to pull the entire structure back into the earth it had risen from. The roof sagged in places, shingles missing in patches that showed dark underlayment like wounds. Windows were boarded up or broken, gaps covered with rotted plywood that hung at odd angles. The front porch, a wide wraparound affair that had probably been grand once, now leaned forward like it was bowing under the weight of years and neglect and profound sadness. "Oh, Harold," Margaret whispered, and he could hear everything in those 2 words. The doubt that had been hovering at the edges of her mind since he'd raised his hand at the auction. The fear that maybe Martha Henderson was right, that maybe they'd just made the biggest mistake of their lives. The overwhelming sense of having bitten off far more than they could chew. But Harold was already out of the truck, boots crunching through leaves that had piled up for seasons unmeasured, his eyes moving over the structure with the practiced gaze of a carpenter who'd spent 50 years evaluating bones and foundations and the truth that lived beneath surface appearances. Margaret followed, her sensible shoes, the orthopedic kind her doctor had recommended for her aching feet, crunching through the leaf litter. The smell hit them first, rich earth and decay and something else, something almost mineral like the house itself was breathing. They'd brought the key the county clerk had given them after the auction, a heavy iron thing that looked like it belonged in a Gothic novel, ornate and oversized and weighing probably half a pound. Harold fit it into the lock on the front door, expecting it to stick, expecting rust and time to have seized the mechanism. But it turned smoothly, almost too smoothly for a house supposedly abandoned for over 4 decades. The tumblers clicked with a sound that seemed to echo through the forest around them. Harold put his shoulder to the door and pushed. It swung open with a groan that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the house's throat, long and low and mournful, as if the building itself was waking from a decades-long sleep it hadn't wanted to end. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling of old wood and dust and time itself, thick and layered like geological strata. Afternoon light slanted through gaps in the boarded windows, illuminating dust particles that floated in the air like tiny stars, like the house was full of suspended cosmos. The entry hall was larger than Harold had expected, with a staircase that curved upward into shadows so deep they looked solid. The craftsmanship was immediately evident even beneath the neglect. The banister was hand-carved walnut, ornate spindles each slightly different, the work of an artisan, not a factory. The floor was hardwood, wide planks that had darkened with age but showed no sign of rot. To the left, an arched doorway led to what looked like a parlor. To the right, another arch opened into what might have been a study or library. Straight ahead, a hallway disappeared into the darkness at the back of the house. Harold stepped inside first, his footsteps echoing on the hardwood floor, the sound bouncing off walls and ceiling in ways that suggested the space was bigger than it appeared. "Bones are good," he said, more to himself than to Margaret, running his hand along the wall. "Floor's solid, no sag, no rot I can see, walls plumb." His carpenter's eye catalogued details automatically. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. Margaret followed, staying close to Harold like she was afraid the house might swallow her if she ventured too far alone. She ran her hand along the wall where wallpaper peeled in long strips, revealing plaster underneath that was smooth and intact, barely cracked despite 40 years of neglect. They moved through the first floor together, room by room, Harold's flashlight beam bouncing off surfaces and revealing spaces that seemed frozen in time. A kitchen with an ancient cast-iron stove, the kind with warming plates and a reservoir for heating water, covered in dust but otherwise pristine. Cabinets lined the walls, their doors hanging open like mouths caught mid-song. A dining room with a chandelier so covered in cobwebs it looked like it was made of lace, hanging above a table that was gone, leaving only impressions in the dust where legs had stood. A library with empty bookshelves climbing to a 12-foot ceiling, built-ins that showed the same meticulous craftsmanship as the entry hall banister. Every room had that same strange quality, neglected but somehow preserved, abandoned but not ruined, as if the house had been waiting, patient and still, for someone to return. "This place is enormous," Margaret said, her voice small in the vast space, swallowed by the emptiness. "Why would someone build something this big out here in the middle of nowhere? 5 miles from town up a barely passable road?" Harold shook his head, wondering the same thing. The construction was odd, too, in ways that made his carpenter's brain itch with questions. Some walls felt thicker than they should be when he knocked on them with his knuckles, the sound hollow and strange. Doorways didn't quite line up with the rooms they led to, forcing you to step right or left as you moved through spaces. There were stairs, a set of 3 steps in the hallway, that went up and then just stopped at a wall, serving no function he could determine. A window placed so high you'd need a ladder to look out. Another set so low it was practically at floor level. "Whoever built this," Harold muttered, running his hand along a baseboard that was made of what looked like cherry wood, expensive and carefully finished, either didn't know what they were doing or knew exactly what they were doing. By the time they left that first day, the sun was setting behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and deep red that seemed almost violent in their beauty, like the heavens were bleeding. Margaret stood on the sagging porch, looking back at the house through the open doorway, at the entry hall with its grand staircase disappearing into shadow. "Harold," she said quietly, and he heard the question in her voice even though she didn't finish the sentence. "We're really doing this?" she finally asked. Harold wrapped his arm around her shoulders that were thinner now than they'd been when they married, more fragile, bones closer to the surface. "We're really doing this," he confirmed. They drove back to Cedar Street in silence, both lost in their own thoughts, watching the mountain roads unwind beneath their headlights. The house on Cedar Street, their home for 43 years, looked smaller somehow when they pulled into the driveway. More worn, more tired, like it knew it was being replaced and was sad about it but understood. That night, lying in their bed for what would be one of the last times, Margaret turned to Harold in the darkness. "Are we crazy?" she whispered. He reached for her hand, laced his fingers through hers the way he'd done for 50 years. "Probably," he said, "but we're crazy together." She squeezed back. "That's all that matters then." The mockery started immediately, spreading through Pine Ridge faster than kudzu on a fence line. At Murphy's General Store the next morning, Harold overheard 2 men by the hunting supplies section, voices carrying over the aisles louder than they probably intended, or maybe exactly as loud as they intended. "Heard Sullivan bought the Blackwood place," one said, and Harold recognized the voice as belonging to Jimmy Torch, who'd worked at the mill with Harold back in the 70s. "Man's got Alzheimer's, has to. No way someone in their right mind spends good money on that death trap." His companion, someone Harold didn't recognize, had laughed, harsh and quick. "Either that or he's got a death wish. Place is gonna collapse on them in their sleep. I give them 6 months before they're crawling back to town begging someone to take it off their hands." Harold had stood in the next aisle, a can of coffee in his hands, and listened to his mental capacity being debated by men who'd probably never taken a risk in their lives. He'd paid for his coffee and left without saying a word, without confronting them, because what was the point? People who'd made up their minds couldn't be reasoned with. They'd see soon enough. Margaret faced it at Curl Up and Die, the beauty parlor where she'd gotten her hair trimmed every 6 weeks for 20 years. Linda, who usually did her trim and color, had clucked her tongue sympathetically while Margaret sat in the chair draped in a cape, watching her own face in the mirror, seeing how old she looked suddenly, how tired. "Margaret, honey," Linda had said, scissors pausing mid-air. "Everyone in town is worried about you and Harold. That house, the Blackwood place, it's not safe. It's not suitable for people your age." Margaret had sat very still, hands folded in her lap under the cape. "We'll make it safe," she'd said simply. "But why?" Linda had pressed, setting down her scissors to make her point more emphatically. "Why that place? Why spend your savings on something everyone knows is a disaster? There are other houses, better houses, houses that don't need years of work just to be livable." Margaret had met Linda's eyes in the mirror, seen the genuine concern there mixed with judgment and something else, something that looked almost like satisfaction at being proven right about how foolish other people could be. "Because everyone said we couldn't," Margaret had said quietly. "Because everyone said it was worthless and we wanted to see for ourselves." Linda had just shaken her head and picked up her scissors again, but the rest of the appointment had been silent and tense, and Margaret knew she wouldn't be coming back. The worst, though, the hardest to bear, came from their daughter, Sarah. She'd driven up from Asheville the following weekend, leaving Tom and the kids at home, making the hour-long drive alone so she could have a serious conversation with her parents. She'd called ahead, her voice tight on the phone, saying they needed to talk. Harold and Margaret had prepared themselves, had sat in their living room on Cedar Street and rehearsed what they'd say, how they'd explain. But no amount of preparation could soften what happened when Sarah walked through the door, her face already creased with worry, her eyes red like she'd been crying during the drive. She'd hugged them both, held on too long and too tight, and then she'd sat them down at the kitchen table and broken. "Dad, Mom," she'd said, her voice cracking on the first words, "this is crazy. This is absolutely insane. You're 70 years old. You spent everything you had, literally everything, on a house that's been falling apart for 40 years in the middle of the woods where there are no neighbors, no help, nothing. What were you thinking?" Harold had held her hand across the kitchen table that had hosted 1,000 family meals, the surface scarred from homework and craft projects and life lived in common. "We're thinking that we've spent our whole lives being sensible, being careful, playing it safe. Maybe it's time to be bold." "Bold?" Sarah's voice had risen, not quite shouting but close, edged with desperation and fear. "This isn't bold. This is reckless. This is dangerous. What if you get hurt out there? What if something happens and you're all the way up that mountain with no phone service, no way to call for help? What if the house collapses? What if there's a fire? What if—" She'd broken off, unable to finish the litany of disasters that clearly played on repeat in her mind. Margaret had spoken then, her voice gentle but firm, the same tone she'd used when Sarah was little and having nightmares. "Sarah, sweetheart, we know you're scared. We're a little scared too. But this house, this project, it feels right. I can't explain it better than that. Sometimes you just know something deep in your bones, and this is one of those times." Tom had appeared in the doorway then, having clearly been listening from the living room where they'd probably thought they'd given Sarah privacy. "Have you at least had it inspected? Checked the foundation, the roof, the electrical and plumbing? Had someone qualified tell you what you're getting into?" Harold had admitted they hadn't. They couldn't afford to. Every dollar they had left, every single penny of their remaining $2,000 was going toward basic supplies and repairs, toward making the house livable enough that they could move in. An inspection would cost $500, maybe more, and they didn't have it to spare. Sarah had left that day angry, hugging them both but unable to hide her frustration, her fear, her sense of helplessness as she watched her parents make what she believed was a catastrophic mistake. As they'd stood on the porch of the Cedar Street house and watched her car disappear down the road toward Asheville, Margaret had turned to Harold with tears in her eyes. "She thinks we've lost our minds," Margaret had whispered. "Maybe we have," Harold had replied, but his small smile said he didn't believe it, not really. The smile said he knew something Sarah didn't, something the whole town didn't, about the difference between careful and cowardly, between wise and simply scared. But he didn't say any of that. He just wrapped his arm around Margaret, and they'd stood there together until the autumn chill drove them inside. They moved into the Blackwood house 2 weeks later, in mid-November, when the leaves had all fallen and the mountains stood bare against gray skies. It took them 3 trips in Harold's truck to transport their belongings, and with each trip Harold was struck by how little they actually owned, how a lifetime of living could be reduced to a few truckloads. Furniture that had seemed substantial in the house on Cedar Street looked pitifully small in the vast rooms of the Blackwood place. Their bed, their dresser, Margaret's sewing machine, Harold's tools, boxes of clothes and kitchen supplies and photographs, and all the small accumulated debris of a marriage. It filled maybe 2 rooms of the sprawling house. The rest remained empty, waiting, patient. They chose a bedroom on the 2nd floor, one of the smaller ones at the back of the house with a window that looked out over the forest. Harold had patched the holes in the walls with joint compound and sanded them smooth. Margaret had scrubbed decades of grime from the hardwood floor, her knees aching, her back protesting until the wood gleamed dull and honest in the afternoon light. They brought in their old bed, the frame creaking as Harold assembled it. The same bed they'd shared since 1979, when they'd finally saved enough to replace the hand-me-down they'd started married life with. Their dresser, Margaret's jewelry box made of rosewood that had been her grandmother's, a lamp that had belonged to Margaret's mother, its shade yellowed but the base solid brass that Harold polished until it shone. They made it theirs. This one room in a house of mysteries, claimed it and marked it with their scent and their presence. That first night, lying in the darkness of a strange house on a mountain 5 miles from town, listening to sounds they didn't recognize, the settling of old wood, the wind through gaps in the boards, something scratching in the walls that might have been mice or squirrels or just the house adjusting to having people inside it again after so long alone. Margaret had whispered into the darkness, "Are we crazy, Harold?" He'd reached for her hand across the expanse of their old bed, found it waiting for his and squeezed. "Probably," he'd said, "but we're crazy together." She'd squeezed back, her grip still strong despite the arthritis, despite the fear, despite everything. "That's all that matters then," she'd agreed. And they'd fallen asleep in their strange new home, 2 old people who'd been mocked and called foolish and told they'd made a terrible mistake, not knowing that beneath their feet, hidden in the bones of this odd house, lay a secret that would change everything. But that discovery was still days away, and for now they simply slept, exhausted from moving, from defending themselves, from choosing hope over fear. Tomorrow they would begin exploring in earnest, begin trying to understand what they'd bought. Tomorrow the mysteries would start revealing themselves. But tonight they just needed rest, and each other, which, as it turned out, would be enough. The days that followed their move into the Blackwood house fell into a rhythm that was both exhausting and exhilarating. Harold would wake before dawn, his internal clock still set to carpenter's hours, even though he'd been retired for 3 years. He'd make coffee in the ancient kitchen on a hot plate they'd brought from Cedar Street, the cast-iron stove still too intimidating to attempt using, and walk through the house with his notebook while morning light crept through gaps in the boarded windows like fingers reaching into darkness. Margaret would wake an hour later, her body needing more rest these days than it used to, and she'd find Harold in some corner of the house with his tape measure and flashlight, making notes in his careful script about what needed fixing, what needed replacing, what needed understanding. They worked room by room, Harold tackling the structural issues while Margaret handled the cleaning. They'd developed a system over 43 years of marriage, an unspoken choreography of partnership where each knew their role without needing to discuss it. Harold would clear debris and make repairs safe enough for Margaret to enter. Margaret would sweep and scrub and wash windows until light could penetrate spaces that had been dark for decades. Slowly, grudgingly, the house began to reveal itself. The parlor had a fireplace with a mantel carved from a single piece of walnut. The craftsmanship so fine Harold stood in front of it for 10 minutes, just running his fingers over the details, the way the wood had been shaped to suggest vines and leaves and hidden faces peering out from foliage. The dining room chandelier, once they'd cleared away the cobwebs, turned out to be genuine crystal, the kind you saw in historic mansions, not mountain homes. The library shelves were built with such precision that even after 40 years of temperature fluctuations and humidity changes, none of the joints had separated. But as they worked, as they moved deeper into the house's mysteries, Harold began noticing things that didn't make sense, inconsistencies that his carpenter's brain couldn't reconcile. In the library, he'd been measuring for new trim to replace sections damaged by water from a roof leak when he'd noticed the room was shorter than it should be. From the outside, the wall extended another 8 feet at least. He'd measured 3 times, checked his math, measured again. The interior dimensions didn't match the exterior. There was space missing, a gap between where the library ended and where the outside wall stood. "Margaret," he'd called, and she'd appeared in the doorway with a dust rag in one hand and a suspicious expression that said she knew that tone in his voice, the one that meant he'd found something interesting or troubling or both. "Look at this," he'd said, showing her his measurements scrawled in the notebook. "Library's 23 feet from the entry hall to this back wall, right? But from outside I measured 32 feet from the front of the house to the back wall on this side. Where's the other 9 feet? Margaret had frowned, following his reasoning. Could it be insulation? Or maybe the walls are thicker than normal? Harold had knocked on the back wall of the library, the one that should have been exterior, but his measurements said couldn't be. The sound came back hollow, definitely not a solid exterior wall packed with insulation. "This is interior construction," he'd said. "Lath and plaster, same as all the other inside walls. But there's nothing behind it, just empty space." They'd found the same inconsistency in 3 other rooms. The master bedroom on the 2nd floor was 6 feet shorter than it should be based on exterior measurements. A closet on the 3rd floor that appeared to be maybe 4 feet deep was only 2 feet when Harold measured inside. The kitchen had a pantry that seemed normal until Harold noticed the door was positioned oddly, not quite flush with the corner, and when he'd examined it more closely he'd realized the entire pantry was shifted 3 feet to the right of where it should be based on the window placement outside. "Someone built hidden spaces into this house," Harold had said one evening a week after they'd moved in, sitting at their small kitchen table with his notebook open between them, pages covered in measurements and sketches and question marks. Deliberately. This wasn't sloppy construction or additions made over time. This was planned from the beginning. Margaret had stared at the notebook, at the evidence of her husband's methodical mind documenting impossibilities. But why, she'd asked. Why build a house with secret spaces? What was Frederick Blackwood hiding? That question hung between them, unanswered, tantalizing. Harold had spent the next 3 days searching for access points, for doors or panels that might open into those hidden spaces. He'd tapped walls, listening for hollow spots, examined baseboards for seams, checked closets for false backs. Margaret had helped, her seamstress's eye trained to spot inconsistencies in patterns, places where wallpaper didn't quite match up, or where trim had been cut in ways that suggested it was covering something rather than finishing something. They found the first mechanism in the dining room, purely by accident. Margaret had been cleaning the built-in china cabinet, wiping decades of grime from the shelves, when her cloth had caught on something. A small metal protrusion no bigger than a shirt button tucked into the decorative molding where the cabinet met the wall. She'd pulled her cloth free and examined it more closely. It looked like a nail head, except it was brass when all the other nail heads in the cabinet were steel, and it protruded slightly, maybe 1/8 of an inch, where nails should be flush. "Harold!" she'd called, and he'd appeared from the kitchen where he'd been attempting to get the old stove operational. "Look at this." He'd examined the brass protrusion, tried to pull it, realized it didn't pull but pushed. He'd pressed it gently. A click, mechanical and precise, echoed through the dining room, and then nothing. They'd waited, listening, but no door had opened. No panel had swung wide, revealing a secret passage. Harold had pressed it again. Another click. This time something different, like the mechanism had reset itself. "It's a lock," Harold had said slowly, understanding dawning. "Or part of one, like a combination. Press it in the right sequence and something opens." They'd spent hours pressing that button in different patterns, different rhythms, 1 press, 2 presses, 3, with pauses between, without pauses, until Margaret's finger was sore and Harold's patience was wearing thin. Nothing happened. "There must be others," Margaret had said. "If it's a combination, there must be other buttons." So they'd searched with renewed purpose, looking now not for access points, but for small brass protrusions hidden in decorative elements. They found the second one 2 days later in the library, tucked into the carved acanthus leaves on the mantel's corner post. The third they discovered in the upstairs hallway, inside a light fixture's base plate. The fourth took another week to locate, hidden in the newel post at the base of the stairs leading to the tower, the section of the house they'd been avoiding because the stairs looked unstable and potentially dangerous. 4 buttons. 4 hidden mechanisms. But what sequence? What combination? Harold had tried everything he could think of. 1, 2, 3, 4 in order. 4, 3, 2, 1 reversed. Random sequences based on dates that might have been meaningful to Frederick Blackwood. Nothing worked. They'd gone to bed frustrated that night, Harold lying awake staring at the ceiling while Margaret slept fitfully beside him. The house creaked and settled around them, making sounds that had become familiar. The whistle of wind through gaps in the boards, the scurry of something small in the walls, the groan of old wood adjusting to temperature changes. And then Harold had heard something different, a rhythmic sound, almost musical. Tap, tap, pause. Tap, pause. Tap, tap, tap. It was coming from somewhere below them, from the first floor maybe, regular and persistent. He'd gotten out of bed, grabbed his flashlight, and gone to investigate, his feet silent on the hardwood floor, careful not to wake Margaret who needed her rest. The sound was louder downstairs, clearer. Tap, tap, pause, tap, pause, tap, tap, tap. It seemed to be coming from everywhere and nowhere, echoing through the empty rooms. Harold had followed it to the library, where it was loudest, and realized it was coming from the fireplace. Water dripping somewhere in the chimney, he'd thought at first. But the rhythm was too regular, too precise, more like a pattern, like a code. Tap, tap, pause, tap, pause. Tap, tap, tap. And then he'd understood. 2 presses, 1 press, 3 presses. Harold had gone to the dining room, to the brass button hidden in the china cabinet, and pressed it twice, ran to the library, pressed the button on the mantel once. Up the stairs to the hallway, pressed that button 3 times, and then down to the tower stairs, to the 4th button in the newel post, and pressed it once more because the pattern had to complete, had to close. The sound that followed was unlike anything Harold had ever heard. Deep within the house, mechanisms engaged. Gears that hadn't turned in decades began moving, metal sliding against metal, counterweights shifting. The sound built, grew louder, came from the walls themselves like the house was waking from a long sleep. Margaret appeared at the top of the stairs in her nightgown, eyes wide with fear and wonder. "Harold, what did you do?" "I don't know," he'd called back honestly. "But something's opening." The sound came to a crescendo and then stopped suddenly, leaving a silence that felt deeper than the one before. Harold stood at the base of the tower stairs, flashlight beam cutting through darkness, breathing hard, heart pounding in his chest in a way that reminded him he was 72 and had a heart condition he wasn't supposed to stress. "Where?" Margaret had asked, coming down the stairs carefully, her hand gripping the railing. "What opened?" They searched together, Harold's flashlight beam sweeping across walls and floors and ceilings. The parlor looked the same, the dining room unchanged. The kitchen, the library, the entry hall, all exactly as they'd been. "Maybe nothing happened," Margaret had said, but her voice carried doubt. Something had happened. They'd both heard it. The house had moved, had responded to Harold's button presses. The change had to be somewhere. They found it in the library, but only because Harold's flashlight had died, and when he'd bent down to grab the spare batteries from his toolbox sitting near the fireplace, he'd noticed something different about the floor. A seam he'd never seen before, a hairline crack in the wood that ran in a perfect rectangle 4 feet wide and 6 feet long, positioned directly in front of the fireplace. He'd traced it with his finger, felt the gap, realized it was deep, went all the way through the floorboards. "Margaret, bring a pry bar from my toolbox," he'd said, his voice tight with excitement and fear and something he couldn't name. She'd rummaged through his tools and handed him the flat bar, the one he used for pulling up stubborn boards. Harold had worked the edge into the seam and pried. The section of floor lifted easily, too easily, revealing itself to be not floor at all, but a panel expertly crafted to look like floor. The grain matched so perfectly you'd never notice unless you were looking for it. Beneath the panel was darkness, and stairs, stone stairs descending into blackness so complete Harold's flashlight beam seemed to get swallowed by it. "Oh my God," Margaret whispered, her hand finding Harold's shoulder, gripping tight. "What is this?" Harold stared down into that darkness, his mind racing. A basement? But they'd already checked the basement, accessed it from the kitchen, found nothing but an empty space with a dirt floor and stone walls, completely ordinary, completely normal, nothing special about it at all. This was something else, something hidden, something Frederick Blackwood had gone to extraordinary lengths to conceal. "There's only one way to find out," Harold said, but his voice shook slightly. Margaret's grip on his shoulder tightened. "Not alone. We go together." So they descended together, Harold first with his flashlight, Margaret behind him with her hand on his shoulder, both for balance and comfort. The stairs were steep, narrow, carved from stone that looked ancient, even though the house itself was barely 60 years old. The walls on either side were close enough to touch, rough-hewn rock that wept moisture. The air grew cooler as they descended, carrying a scent that Margaret couldn't identify, something old and preserved and not quite earthly. 20 steps down. 30. 40. Harold counted them automatically, his carpenter's mind cataloging details even as his heart hammered with anticipation and dread. At 50 steps, the stairs ended at a landing, and at the landing stood a door. Not a wooden door like you'd expect in a house, a steel door, heavy gauge, industrial, the kind you'd see on a bank vault or a ship's bulkhead. It had a wheel lock, like something from a submarine, painted black but showing rust around the edges where moisture had found purchase. Harold ran his hand over it, felt the cold metal, the solid reality of it. "This isn't just a basement," Margaret said unnecessarily. "This is something serious, something important." Harold gripped the wheel lock, expecting it to be frozen solid, expecting to need WD-40 and leverage and probably help from someone stronger. But it turned. Stiff, yes, resisting, but it turned. 1 rotation, 2, 3, 4. On the fifth rotation, something deep within the mechanism released with a sound like breaking bone, metal sliding through metal, bolts retracting. Harold pulled. The door swung outward, surprisingly balanced despite its weight, moving on hinges that had been engineered to last. Cool air rushed out, carrying that smell stronger now, mineral and old and somehow clean, preserved air that hadn't been breathed in decades. They stepped through into darkness so complete their flashlight beams seemed to create light rather than reveal it. Harold swept his beam left and right, trying to get a sense of the space. Large, very large. His beam couldn't find the far wall. Margaret found a light switch on the wall near the door, covered in cobwebs but intact. She flipped it, not expecting anything, but lights came on. Fluorescent tubes in the ceiling, flickering to life one by one, buzzing and humming, casting a greenish-white glow that grew stronger as more tubes warmed up. And as the light increased, as the room revealed itself, Harold and Margaret stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what they were seeing. It was a vault, not a basement, not a storage room, not a wine cellar or a root cellar or any normal thing. A vault. The room was enormous, easily 40 feet on each side, the ceiling 12 feet high and arched like a cathedral. And everywhere, covering every surface, filling every available space, were treasures. Paintings lined the walls, dozens of them, in ornate frames that gleamed even under the harsh fluorescent light. Not prints, not reproductions, but real paintings. Oil on canvas, the texture visible even from across the room, the brush strokes preserved in dried paint that caught the light. Sculptures stood on pedestals arranged in careful rows, bronze and marble and what looked like gold, figures frozen in motion, faces captured in expressions of joy and sorrow and everything between. Glass cases held smaller items, jewelry that sparkled with what had to be real gemstones, books bound in leather with gold leaf on the spines, documents sealed in protective sleeves, artifacts that looked ancient and priceless and impossible. "This isn't real," Margaret said, but her voice was barely a whisper, barely sound at all. "This can't be real." Harold walked forward on legs that felt disconnected from his body, moved toward the nearest painting like a man in a dream. It showed a woman in a blue dress sitting by a window, light falling across her face in a way that made her seem alive, present, about to speak. The style was familiar, reminding Harold of paintings he'd seen in books, in museums during the one trip to New York he and Margaret had taken for their 25th anniversary. The frame was ornate, gilded, heavy. At the bottom, attached with small brass screws, was a plaque. "The Woman in Blue, Claude Monet, Oil on Canvas, 1878. Harold's breath caught in his throat. He moved to the next painting. A landscape, rolling hills and a brilliant sky, painted with such skill that it seemed to have depth, to be a window rather than a canvas. The plaque read, "Provence Afternoon, Paul Cézanne, Oil on Canvas, 1892. And the next. Portrait of a Dancer, Edgar Degas, Oil on Canvas, 1886. And the next. Still Life with Pears, Pierre-Auguste Renoir, Oil on Canvas, 1879. "Harold," Margaret's voice came from across the room, high and tight with something between terror and wonder. "Come look at this." He crossed to where she stood in front of a sculpture, a bronze figure of a man in motion, muscles caught mid-stride, every detail perfect. The plaque read, "The Runner, Auguste Rodin, Bronze, 1895. Margaret's hand was shaking as she pointed to another sculpture nearby. "The Thinker's Brother, Auguste Rodin, Bronze, 1898. And another, "Morning Dance, Edgar Degas, Bronze, 1903. They moved through the vault like ghosts, touching nothing, afraid to breathe too hard, cataloging in stunned silence the impossible wealth surrounding them. Cases of jewelry held necklaces with diamonds the size of peas, earrings with rubies that glowed like trapped fire, bracelets of platinum and gold wrought in designs so intricate they seemed like lace made of metal. Books lined one wall, leather-bound first editions, signed copies, rare volumes Harold recognized by title if not by sight. Leaves of Grass by Walt Whitman signed. The Great Gatsby first edition, dust jacket intact. Ulysses by James Joyce, one of the original Paris printings. Documents in protective cases bore signatures Harold recognized from history class. A letter from Abraham Lincoln, the handwriting distinctive even under the protective plastic. A land grant signed by Thomas Jefferson. A bond certificate from the Confederate States of America, worthless as currency but priceless as history. In the center of the vault, positioned like an altar, sat a desk. Oak, massive, the kind executives used in the 1950s with brass handles and green leather inlay on the writing surface. On that desk sat a leather-bound journal, large and thick, the cover embossed with gold lettering, Collection Inventory, Frederick Blackwood. Harold approached it with hands that trembled worse than they had in years, worse than when he'd proposed to Margaret, worse than when he'd held newborn Sarah, worse than any moment he could remember. He opened the journal to the first page. The handwriting was neat, precise, the hand of someone educated and methodical. Collection begun April 1967. Purpose: to preserve beauty and historical significance for future generations, to protect what others would exploit or destroy, to build something that outlasts the builder. Harold turned pages, Margaret reading over his shoulder, their flashlights unnecessary now in the vault's artificial day. Every item in the vault was listed. Every painting, every sculpture, every piece of jewelry, every book, every document. Each entry included a description, a date of acquisition, provenance where known, and an estimated value. The numbers made Harold's head spin. $50,000, $120,000, $350,000. The values climbed higher as he turned pages. $800,000, $1.2 million, $3.7 million. "Harold," Margaret breathed, her hand finding his arm, gripping so tight it hurt, but he didn't care, barely felt it. "These numbers, they can't be right. They're too large. They're impossible." But Harold had reached a page that made his heart stop. The Woman in Blue, Claude Monet. Oil on canvas, 1878. Acquired from private estate sale, Paris, France, June 1969. Provenance authenticated by Galerie Durand Ruel. Estimated value, $4,200,000. $4 million for one painting. Harold's hands shook so badly he nearly dropped the journal. He set it carefully on the desk, stepped back, looked around the vault with new eyes. If that one painting was worth over $4 million, and there were dozens more, and sculptures and jewelry and books and documents, how much was the entire collection worth? He flipped to the back of the journal, searching for a total, a sum, something to anchor his reeling mind. The last entry was dated December 1978, written in the same neat hand but slightly shakier, as if the writer had been tired or old or scared. Collection complete. Final inventory, 217 items. Total estimated value based on current market appraisal, $247 million. The number sat on the page like a bomb that hadn't exploded yet. $247 million. Margaret made a sound that wasn't quite a gasp and wasn't quite a sob. Her legs gave out and she sat down hard on the stone floor, her hands pressed to her face. Harold stood frozen, staring at that number, trying to make it real in his mind. They'd bought this house for $6,000, spent their last $12,000 to move in, been mocked and called senile and foolish. And all this time, beneath their feet, hidden in the bones of this strange house, had been a fortune beyond anything they'd ever imagined, beyond anything they'd ever dreamed possible. $247 million. It was more than the entire town of Pine Ridge was worth, more than Harold would earn in 1,000 lifetimes of carpentry, more than seemed real or possible or true. "We have to tell someone," Margaret said from the floor, her voice muffled by her hands. We have to call the police or a lawyer or someone. This is too big. This is too much." Harold wanted to agree, wanted to pick up the phone and call. Who? The sheriff, their daughter. But something stopped him. Fear, maybe. Or caution. Or the knowledge that once they told anyone, once this secret got out, their lives would never be the same. Everything would change. The mockery would turn to envy. The dismissal would become attention. They'd be vulnerable in ways they'd never been before. "Not yet," Harold said, surprising himself. "Not until we understand what we have, what it means, what we're supposed to do with it." Margaret looked up at him, her face pale in the fluorescent light. "What do you mean? We have to report this. We can't just keep it secret." "I'm not saying keep it secret forever," Harold said, kneeling beside her, taking her hands. "I'm saying we need to be smart. We need to know what we're dealing with before we tell anyone. We need to research, to verify, to understand." He gestured at the vault around them. "These could be fakes, forgeries, worthless copies. We need to know before we get the whole town excited." But even as he said it, Harold knew they weren't fakes. The craftsmanship, the materials, the way the paintings seemed to glow with inner life, these were real. Frederick Blackwood had amassed one of the greatest private art collections in history and hidden it away in a vault beneath a strange house in the mountains of North Carolina. And now, through pure chance or fate or blind luck, that collection belonged to Harold and Margaret Sullivan. They sat together on the cold stone floor of the vault, surrounded by more wealth than they could comprehend, and held each other in silence, not celebrating, not rejoicing, just trying to absorb the enormity of what they'd discovered, trying to understand how their lives had just changed in ways they couldn't begin to predict. After a time that might have been minutes or hours, Harold helped Margaret to her feet. They walked through the vault again, this time taking photographs with the digital camera Sarah had given them last Christmas. Every painting, every sculpture, every case of jewelry, every shelf of books. They photographed the journal pages, all of them, the inventory and the values, and Frederick Blackwood's neat handwriting documenting his obsession. By the time they climbed back up the stone stairs, the sun was rising outside, painting the boarded windows with light that seemed too ordinary, too normal for what they'd just experienced. They emerged into the library, closed the hidden panel in the floor, made sure it was sealed and undetectable. Then they went to the kitchen and made coffee and sat at their small table, not speaking, just existing together in the presence of a secret that was too large to hold alone but too dangerous to share. "We need to verify," Harold said finally. "Research. Find out if these pieces are really what the journal says they are." Margaret nodded, exhausted but agreeing. "How?" "The library," Harold said. "We'll go to Asheville, use the computers at the main library. Search for these artists, these specific pieces. See if any match what we saw in the vault." Over the next 3 days, they made the drive to Asheville every morning, spending hours at the library computers, Harold's reading glasses perched on his nose, Margaret's fingers slow on the unfamiliar keyboard, searching databases and museum records and auction results. And piece by piece, painting by painting, sculpture by sculpture, they confirmed their impossible discovery. The Woman in Blue had been part of a private collection sold in Paris in 1969, then disappeared from public record. Experts believed it had been destroyed or lost, but it wasn't. It was in their vault. The Runner by Rodin had been commissioned by a wealthy American collector in 1895, last seen in a Philadelphia estate in 1934, then vanished. Museum curators had searched for it for decades, but it wasn't lost. It was in their vault. On and on the confirmations came, each search revealing that another piece of their collection was a missing masterwork, a lost treasure, something the art world believed was gone forever. By the third day, Harold and Margaret had verified 40 pieces. Every single one was authentic, was valuable, was exactly what Frederick Blackwood's journal claimed. The $247 million estimate from 1978 was conservative. With decades of appreciation, with the rarity of these lost pieces, their collection was worth more, possibly much more. "We have to tell someone now," Margaret said on the drive back from Asheville that third evening. "We have to get help with this. We can't manage it alone." Harold agreed, but the question remained, who did they trust? Who could they tell who wouldn't try to take it or exploit them or leak the secret before they were ready? Not the local police, not yet. Not until they had legal representation, someone who understood art law and estate law and how to protect them from the chaos that would come. "Sarah," Margaret said. "We tell Sarah first." Harold wanted to agree, but he hesitated. Sarah who'd called them foolish for buying the house. Sarah who'd cried and begged them to reconsider. Could they trust her with this? Would she try to take control, make decisions for them, treat them like they were too old to handle it themselves? "Not yet," Harold said again. "There's someone else first." He was thinking of Dennis Porter, his old friend from the service, who'd moved to Asheville and worked as an insurance appraiser for estates and museums. Dennis was discreet, knowledgeable, and most importantly, someone Harold trusted absolutely. They'd served together in Vietnam, shared foxholes and fear and promises to survive. If Harold could trust anyone with this secret, it was Dennis. The phone call was brief. "I need your help," Harold had said when Dennis answered. "And I need you to be discreet." Dennis had been quiet for a moment, then asked, "How discreet?" "Life or death discreet." Another pause. "I'll be there tomorrow." Dennis Porter arrived at 10 in the morning driving an unmarked sedan, wearing khakis and a windbreaker, looking more like someone's kindly grandfather than a man who'd appraised collections for the Smithsonian and consulted with the FBI on art fraud cases. He was 71, a year younger than Harold, his hair white as mountain snow, his eyes sharp and assessing behind wire-rimmed glasses. He hugged Harold on the porch, shook Margaret's hand with genuine warmth, looked up at the strange house and whistled low. "Hell of a place you got here, Harold. You always did have unusual taste." They'd sat him down in the kitchen, given him coffee and told him everything. About the tower and the hidden buttons, about the pattern and the mechanism, about the stone stairs and the steel door and the vault full of treasures that shouldn't exist. Dennis had listened without interrupting, his expression carefully neutral, the same face he'd worn in Vietnam when Harold had told him about enemy positions or dangerous patrols, a face that revealed nothing but absorbed everything. When they finished, Dennis set down his coffee cup very carefully, like it might explode if he moved too fast. "Show me," he said simply. They took him through it all, pressing the buttons in sequence, the 2-1-3-1 pattern that opened the mechanism, the sound of gears engaging, the panel lifting, the stone stairs descending into darkness. Dennis followed them down without hesitation, his breathing steady, his military training evident in how he moved through uncertain terrain. When they opened the steel door and the fluorescent lights flickered to life, when the vault revealed itself in all its impossible glory, Dennis stopped breathing. Harold watched his friend, this man who'd seen priceless collections in museums around the world, who'd authenticated paintings for auction houses and appraised estates worth millions, and saw genuine shock on his face for the first time since they'd met in 1968. Dennis walked through the vault like a man in a trance, moving from painting to sculpture to case of jewelry, his hands hovering over items but not touching, his eyes cataloging, assessing, understanding. He pulled reading glasses from his pocket, examined signatures on paintings, checked maker's marks on sculptures, studied the cut and clarity of diamonds through the glass cases. He opened the leather journal, flipped through pages with increasing speed, his face growing paler with each turn. An hour passed. Then 2. Finally, Dennis turned to face them, his hand gripping the edge of Frederick Blackwood's desk like he needed support. "Do you have any idea what you have here?" he asked, his voice rough. Harold and Margaret shook their heads. Dennis pulled a handkerchief from his pocket, removed his glasses, cleaned them unnecessarily, a delaying tactic while he found words adequate to the moment. Frederick Blackwood. I've heard the name. He was a collector, very private, very wealthy. Disappeared in the late 70s. There were rumors he'd gone into hiding somewhere remote, that he'd built a fortress to protect his collection from the chaos of the world. People thought it was nonsense, the paranoid fantasy of a rich eccentric. He laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. Turns out it wasn't nonsense at all. He gestured at the vault around them. The journal says $247 million in 1978. That was conservative even then. With appreciation, with the rarity of these pieces, with the fact that half the art world thinks these works are lost forever. He paused, his hand shaking slightly. You're looking at closer to $500 million, maybe more. The number was so large it lost meaning, became just sounds, just syllables without weight or reality. Harold felt Margaret sway beside him, caught her elbow, steadied her. That can't be right, Harold said, though his voice carried no conviction. Dennis shook his head. I've been doing this for 40 years. I know value. I know rarity. I know what collectors will pay for pieces like these. He pointed to the woman in blue. That Monet alone, if it's authenticated, and I believe it will be, is worth $60 million, maybe more at auction. He moved to the runner. Rodin's sculptures of this quality, with this provenance, 40 to 50 million? On and on he went, assigning values that climbed higher and higher until the numbers became meaningless, became just proof of impossibility made real. What do we do? Margaret whispered. Dennis sat down on the edge of Frederick Blackwood's desk, suddenly looking all of his 71 years, looking tired and overwhelmed and human. That's the question, isn't it? What you do will determine everything that comes next. He looked at Harold, at Margaret, at two ordinary people who'd stumbled into something extraordinary. First, we document everything properly. Photographs, detailed inventory, authentication where possible. I can help with that. Then we need to contact authorities, the right authorities. FBI Art Crime Team maybe, IRS definitely, Cultural Heritage Foundation. This isn't just about value. Some of these pieces are historically significant. They belong in museums. And what about us? Harold asked. Do we have a right to any of it? Dennis was quiet for a long time, thinking through the legal complexities. You bought the property legally. Everything on it or in it should belong to you by right of purchase. But that will be challenged. By governments, by heirs if any exist, by people who'll claim you somehow swindled Blackwood or knew about the collection before you bought the house. You're looking at years of legal battles. Margaret closed her eyes, exhaustion and fear washing over her. We just wanted a house, she said, and her voice broke on the last word. Dennis stood, crossed to them, put a hand on each of their shoulders. I know, but you got something more. Something that could change your lives, could help people, could preserve history and beauty for generations. That's worth fighting for. They stood together in the vault, three old people surrounded by treasures, and Harold felt the weight of the decision settling on his shoulders. They could walk away, pretend they'd never found it, sell the house and go back to being ordinary. Or they could embrace what they'd discovered, fight for it, protect it, share it with a world that didn't know how much beauty it had lost. We fight, Harold said simply. Margaret looked at him, saw the determination in his face, the stubborn streak that had made him buy this house in the first place, and nodded. We fight, she agreed. Dennis smiled, tired but genuine. Then let's get to work. They had found their treasure. Now came the hard part, keeping it, protecting it, and deciding what kind of people they wanted to be with the impossible gift fate had dropped in their laps. The answer to that question would define everything that came next. What happens next would test their resolve in ways they never imagined, reveal truths nobody expected, and remind us why sometimes the quietest voices carry the most power. Stay tuned to see what happens next. If you're enjoying the story, please like, share, and subscribe for more. The documentation process took 2 weeks. Dennis Porter moved into one of the empty bedrooms on the second floor, setting up a makeshift office with equipment he'd brought from Asheville in 3 trips. Professional cameras with specialized lighting, measuring tools calibrated to museum standards, authentication instruments that looked like they belonged in a science fiction movie. He photographed each piece from multiple angles, recorded every detail visible to the naked eye and some that weren't, cross-referenced items with Frederick Blackwood's journal and with his own extensive database of art and artifacts compiled over 4 decades of appraisal work. Harold and Margaret helped where they could, carrying equipment, holding lights, making notes in fresh notebooks Dennis had provided. But mostly they watched, still processing the reality of what they'd found, still trying to make it real in their minds. Each evening, after hours in the vault, they'd climb the stone stairs and emerge into the library where normal light seemed too bright, too ordinary. They'd sit at the kitchen table, the 3 of them, and Dennis would walk them through what he'd documented that day, explaining provenance and artistic technique and market value in language they could understand. "This Degas," he'd say, showing them photographs on his laptop screen. "It's part of a series he did of dancers. Museums have 12 of them. This is the 13th, the one collectors thought was destroyed in a fire in Brussels in 1931. But it wasn't. Frederick Blackwood bought it from a private seller in 1968, paid $80,000 for it. Today, with the other 12 pieces in museums and this one believed lost, it could bring $70 million at auction. $70 million. For one painting. The numbers still didn't feel real, still bounced off Harold's mind like rain off a tin roof, unable to penetrate, unable to find purchase in a consciousness built on carpenters' wages and modest living. By the end of the first week, Dennis had documented and authenticated 93 pieces. By the end of the second week, he'd finished the entire collection. 217 items, exactly as Frederick Blackwood's journal had claimed, and the total value, calculated conservatively using current market comparables and auction records, came to $487 million. Dennis had delivered that number on a Saturday evening, the 3 of them sitting at the kitchen table with coffee gone cold, the weight of the sum pressing down like a physical thing. "That's the conservative estimate," Dennis had said, his voice flat with exhaustion and awe. "If you were to auction the collection piece by piece, if collectors got into bidding wars, if the provenance stories got out about pieces being lost and found, you could see $1 billion, maybe more." Margaret had excused herself, gone to the bathroom, and Harold had heard her being sick. When she'd returned, her face was pale but composed. "I'm sorry," she'd said. "It's just too much. My brain can't hold numbers that big." Dennis had nodded with understanding. "Nobody's brain can. That's why we need help, professional help, legal help. You need lawyers who specialize in art law, estate law, tax law. You need financial advisors who work with high-net-worth individuals. You need security consultants who understand how to protect assets this valuable." He'd paused, looked at both of them seriously. "And you need all of it before anyone else finds out, because once this gets out, your lives will never be the same. People will come out of the woodwork claiming rights to the collection, making accusations, filing lawsuits. The media will descend. Your privacy will evaporate. You need to be prepared." Harold and Margaret had looked at each other across the table, the same look they'd shared 1,000 times over 50 years of marriage, the look that asked, "Are we strong enough for this?" And the answer in their eyes was the same as always. Together, yes. On Monday morning, Dennis had driven them to Asheville to meet with Marcus Green, a lawyer he'd worked with on estate cases, someone he trusted absolutely. Marcus was 53, sharp-eyed and sharper-minded, with a reputation for protecting clients against impossible odds. His office occupied the top floor of a restored tobacco warehouse, all exposed brick and polished concrete, the kind of space that looked expensive without trying. Marcus had listened to their story without interrupting, making notes on a yellow legal pad in handwriting so small and precise it looked like code. When they'd finished, when Dennis had shown him the documentation and the photographs and the inventory, Marcus had set down his pen very carefully. "This is the most significant discovery of lost art I've ever encountered," he'd said, "and it's going to be a nightmare to protect." He'd walked them through the legal landscape, speaking in plain language when he remembered, but occasionally lapsing into lawyer speak that went over Harold's head. The collection legally belonged to them as part of the property purchase. But that ownership would be challenged from multiple directions. The federal government might claim the pieces were national treasures that couldn't be privately owned. State governments might argue the same. Foreign governments might claim pieces were stolen from their countries during wars or colonial periods. Heirs of Frederick Blackwood, if any existed, might sue saying they'd been defrauded of their inheritance. Other potential buyers at the auction might claim they'd been deceived about the property's true value. And the IRS would definitely want their share, estate taxes and capital gains and penalties if they believed Harold and Margaret had known about the collection before purchasing the property. "The good news," Marcus had said, "is that you didn't know. You have documentation proving you bought the house for $6,000 at a public auction, documentation of your financial situation showing you couldn't have afforded to buy it if you'd known what it contained. Witnesses who heard people trying to talk you out of the purchase. That protects you from accusations of fraud." He'd paused. "The bad news is everything else. You're looking at years of legal challenges, millions in legal fees, constant scrutiny of every aspect of your lives. The question you need to answer, and answer honestly, is whether you're prepared for that fight." Harold and Margaret had sat in the expensive chairs in the expensive office and held hands like teenagers, drawing strength from each other. "We're prepared," Harold had said, and Margaret had nodded agreement. Marcus had smiled, the kind of smile that suggested he'd hoped they'd say that. "Then let's get to work." They'd tried to keep it quiet. They'd really tried. Marcus had filed paperwork with various agencies under seal where possible, using legal mechanisms designed to protect sensitive information during preliminary review. Dennis had been discreet with his contacts, reaching out only to people he trusted, asking questions in ways that didn't reveal the full scope of what they'd found. Harold and Margaret had said nothing to anyone, not even Sarah, not yet, not until they had legal protection in place and a plan for moving forward. But secrets that large have gravity. They pull people toward them, warp the space around them, make their presence known even when hidden. The first leak came from the county clerk's office. Someone noticed the sealed filings, got curious, made inquiries, talked to someone who talked to someone else. Within a week, rumors were circulating in Pine Ridge. The Sullivans had found something in the old Blackwood place, something valuable, something big. The rumors started small and vague. "Heard Harold and Margaret found some antiques up there. Someone said there's old furniture. Might be worth something. Jimmy said his cousin who works at the courthouse said there's lawyers involved, fancy lawyers from Asheville. But rumors are like seeds. Plant them in fertile ground and they grow, mutate, become something wild and unrecognizable. By the second week, the rumors had expanded. They found a fortune in gold coins buried in the basement. Old Blackwood had a stash of bearer bonds, millions of dollars worth. There's paintings up there, famous ones, stuff you'd see in museums. And by the third week, the rumors had reached critical mass. Someone posted on Facebook, someone else shared it, someone else added their own speculation, and suddenly the entire town was talking about nothing else. The Sullivans had found treasure. The crazy old couple who'd been mocked for buying that worthless house had stumbled into more money than God. The change in how people treated them was immediate and nauseating. Martha Henderson, who'd stopped speaking to Margaret after the beauty parlor incident, suddenly appeared at their door with a casserole and a smile so wide it looked painful. "Margaret, I felt just terrible about how things were left between us," she'd said, thrusting the dish forward like an offering. "I wanted to apologize and see how you're doing. This must be such an overwhelming time. Margaret had accepted the casserole, but not the reconciliation, her voice cool. "Thank you, Martha. We're managing." "If there's anything I can do to help," Martha had pressed. "Anything at all. I know you must need people you can trust right now." "We do," Margaret had agreed. "That's why we're being careful about who we let close." She'd closed the door gently but firmly, leaving Martha on the porch with her false smile crumbling. Buck Wilson, who'd warned Harold at the auction about wasting his money, now stopped him at Murphy's General Store with a hearty slap on the back that was too hard to be friendly. "Harold, been meaning to catch up with you. Heard you're doing some renovations up at the place, might need some help with that. My brother Dale and me, we're real handy, could give you a good rate on any work you need done." Harold had just looked at him, this man who'd called him senile 2 months ago. "Appreciate the offer, Buck, but we've got everything handled." "Well, if that changes," Buck had pressed, pulling out a business card that looked freshly printed. "You just give me a call. Friends help friends, you know." "I do know," Harold had said. "That's why I'm being careful about who I call friends." The sudden friends were everywhere. People Harold and Margaret hadn't spoken to in years, people who'd actively avoided them after they'd bought the house, people who'd whispered about their foolishness and senility, all suddenly concerned and available and eager to help with anything they might need. The invitations came daily. Dinner parties they were suddenly essential guests at, church socials where they'd be honored attendees, community meetings where their input was desperately needed. Everyone wanted a piece of them, wanted proximity to the couple who'd gone from town jokes to town celebrities in the span of 3 weeks. But worse than the false friends were the lawyers. Letters arrived daily, some by certified mail, others just stuffed in the mailbox that still bore the word thieves someone had spray-painted months ago and Harold hadn't gotten around to replacing. Letters from law firms they'd never heard of, representing clients they'd never met, claiming interest in the property or the collection or demanding compensation for various alleged wrongs. One letter claimed to represent a distant cousin of Frederick Blackwood, third cousin twice removed, demanding her rightful share of her family inheritance. Another came from a man who said he'd been planning to bid at the auction but had been delayed by traffic, claiming the sale should be voided because not all interested parties had been able to participate. A third arrived from a law firm in New York representing a consortium of art collectors who argued that pieces of such historical significance shouldn't be in private hands and should be donated to public institutions immediately. Marcus Green had reviewed each letter, filed them in folders organized by level of threat, and started preparing responses and counterclaims. "Most of these are frivolous," he'd said. "Opportunists hoping you'll settle just to make them go away. But some are serious. This one," he'd tapped a letter from a firm in Washington, D.C., "represents the Cultural Heritage Foundation. They're arguing several pieces in your collection were looted from European museums during World War II and should be returned to their countries of origin." "Were they?" Harold had asked. Marcus had shrugged. "We're investigating provenance. So far, everything Dennis authenticated shows legal acquisition, proper documentation, legitimate sales. But proving that to the satisfaction of various international bodies is going to take time and money." "How much money?" Harold had asked. "Millions," Marcus had said bluntly. "You're looking at 5 to 10 million in legal fees over the next few years, maybe more if cases go to trial." Harold's carpenter's salary, his entire lifetime of earnings, had been maybe $2 million before taxes. The idea of spending $10 million just to keep what was legally his felt obscene, impossible. But the alternative was losing everything, so they'd signed the retainer agreements and watched their new wealth start evaporating to protect itself. The threats started in the 4th week. An envelope with no return address, postmarked from Asheville, containing a single sheet of paper with words cut from magazines like a movie ransom note. "You don't deserve what you found. Give it back or face consequences." Harold had shown it to Marcus, who'd forwarded it to the FBI. Agent Erin Mitchell, a specialist with the art crime team who'd been assigned to their case, had been blunt in her assessment. Probably just a crank, someone angry you got lucky when they didn't. But take it seriously. Install security cameras, vary your routines, let us know if anything else comes. More threats followed. Unsigned letters arriving weekly, phone calls in the middle of the night, heavy breathing or silence before the line went dead. Someone slashed the tires on Harold's truck while it was parked outside Murphy's. Another time they'd returned from Asheville to find a window broken, nothing stolen, just a warning that someone could get inside whenever they wanted. Margaret started sleeping poorly, waking at every sound, convinced someone was breaking in to steal the collection or worse. Harold bought a shotgun, the first weapon he'd owned since Vietnam, kept it loaded by the bed despite hating that it had come to this. They installed the security system Agent Mitchell recommended, cameras covering every approach to the house, motion sensors, panic buttons in every room. The house that had been a refuge, a project, a promise, started feeling like a prison, but they didn't break. Couldn't break. They'd faced hard things before, poverty and loss and years when it seemed like nothing would ever get easier. This was just another hard thing, bigger and stranger, but still just another challenge to overcome together. "We're not letting them win," Margaret had said one night after finding another threatening letter in the mailbox. "We're not giving up what we found just because people are scared or angry or greedy." Harold had pulled her close, feeling how thin she'd gotten, how much weight she'd lost from stress. "No, we're not," he'd agreed. "We're going to see this through." Support came from unexpected places. Dennis Porter, who'd initially been hired as a consultant, refused to leave, said he'd seen too much to walk away now, that he wanted to see this story to its conclusion. He worked without charging additional fees, living in their spare room, eating meals with them, becoming family in the way soldiers who've been through combat together become family. Old Man Ritchie, who Harold barely knew, stopped by one afternoon with a box of ammunition for the shotgun and a nod. "Heard you're having trouble. Figure a man's got a right to protect what's his." He'd left before Harold could thank him properly. Father Kent from First Baptist, the church Harold and Margaret had stopped attending when people started treating them differently, showed up unannounced and asked if he could pray with them. Not about the money, not about the collection, just for peace and protection and the strength to handle what God had laid in their path. Margaret had cried during that prayer, the first real tears she'd let fall since the discovery, and afterward felt lighter somehow, unburdened. And then Sarah arrived. She'd been calling every few days since the rumors had started, her voice tight with worry and confusion, asking if the stories were true, if they'd really found something, why they hadn't told her. Harold and Margaret had deflected, said they'd explain everything in person, asked her to be patient just a little longer. But when someone posted photos online, blurry shots taken with a telephoto lens from somewhere in the woods showing FBI vehicles at the property, Sarah had gotten in her car and driven straight up from Asheville, arriving at 8 in the evening on a Tuesday with fury and fear in equal measure on her face. "Tell me everything," she'd demanded, "right now. No more secrets." So they'd told her, all of it, the buttons and the mechanism, the stone stairs and the steel door, the vault full of treasures worth $500 million. They'd shown her Dennis's documentation, Marcus's legal briefs, the threatening letters, the security camera footage of someone lurking at 3 in the morning. They'd laid it all out and waited for her reaction. Sarah had sat at the kitchen table in silence for a long time, processing, her face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. Finally, she'd looked up at her parents, at these two elderly people who'd been mocked and dismissed, who'd risked everything on a broken house and found a fortune, who were now under siege from people who wanted to take it all away. "I'm sorry," she'd said, and her voice broke on the words. "I'm sorry I called you foolish. I'm sorry I didn't trust you. I'm sorry I wasn't here sooner." Margaret had reached across the table, taken her daughter's hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." Sarah had nodded, wiped her eyes, and her expression had hardened with determination that reminded Harold of Margaret when she was young, that stubborn refusal to be beaten that had attracted him in the first place. "What do you need?" Sarah had asked. "What can I do to help?" From that moment, Sarah had become their protector, their advocate, their fierce defender against anyone who tried to take advantage of her parents. She'd taken leave from her job, moved temporarily into one of the empty bedrooms, and appointed herself gatekeeper. When false friends called, Sarah answered and politely told them Harold and Margaret weren't available. When reporters showed up at the property line asking for interviews, Sarah met them with a smile and a firm, "No comment." When Buck Wilson appeared again with another offer to help, Sarah had stepped between him and her father and said clearly, "My parents don't need anything from people who called them senile 2 months ago. You can leave now." She'd organized their lives, scheduled their legal meetings, coordinated with Agent Mitchell and Marcus Green, kept files and records, and made sure nothing fell through the cracks. She'd brought her kids up on weekends, teenagers now who thought the whole situation was exciting and couldn't understand why Grandma and Grandpa seemed stressed instead of thrilled. The normalcy they brought, their oblivious joy at being in the strange house, their excitement about the secret vault even though they weren't allowed to see it yet, helped ground Harold and Margaret in ways nothing else could. This was still their family. This was still their life. The money hadn't changed that, not the essential parts. But the investigation into Frederick Blackwood had opened doors that raised uncomfortable questions. Agent Mitchell and her team had been thorough, digging into every aspect of Blackwood's life, trying to verify the provenance of each piece in the collection, making sure nothing was stolen or illegally obtained. What they'd found was a story both sad and troubling. Frederick Blackwood had been born in 1922 to a wealthy Philadelphia family, old money from railroads and steel. He'd served in World War II, seen combat in Europe, been present when Allied forces had liberated museums and discovered the extent of Nazi looting, seen priceless art destroyed by bombs and fire and the simple chaos of war. Something about that experience had changed him, made him obsessed with preservation, with protecting beauty against the forces that would destroy it. After the war, he'd devoted his life to collecting, using his family fortune to acquire pieces at auctions and estate sales, building relationships with dealers and other collectors, always buying, always adding to what would become one of the most significant private collections in history. But he'd also become paranoid. He'd believed, and maybe not without reason, that governments couldn't be trusted to protect art, that museums were vulnerable to theft and natural disasters and political upheaval, that the only way to truly preserve beauty was to hide it, secure it, keep it safe from a world that destroyed what it couldn't control. In the 1960s, he'd disappeared from Philadelphia society, sold his family estate and bought land in North Carolina, where he'd built the strange house with its hidden vault, designed specifically to protect his collection from discovery until, he'd written in a letter Agent Mitchell had found in the National Archives, "Someone worthy finds it, someone who'll understand what I tried to do." Frederick Blackwood had died in 1979, not mysteriously as the rumors suggested, but quietly in a veterans' hospital in Asheville alone, estranged from what little family remained. He'd never told anyone about the house, about the collection, about the fortune he'd buried in the mountains. He'd just let it sit there, waiting for someone to stumble upon it 45 years later. He wanted it found, Agent Mitchell had explained during one of her visits. The mechanisms, the journal, the way he documented everything, he designed it all to be discovered eventually. He just wanted it to be someone who'd protect it, not exploit it. Harold had thought about that, about a man so damaged by war that he'd spent his life hiding beauty instead of sharing it, so afraid of loss that he'd created loss by choice. "That's sad," Margaret had said, and Agent Mitchell had nodded agreement. "It is, but it's also your opportunity to do what he couldn't, to share what he hid, to let the world see what he protected." That thought had kept Harold awake at night, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like physical mass. They could sell the collection, pay the taxes, keep enough to be comfortable for the rest of their lives, become wealthy beyond their wildest dreams. It would be legal, justified, theirs by right of discovery and purchase. Or they could do something else, something harder but maybe more meaningful. They could honor Frederick Blackwood's intention, twisted as it had become, and find a way to protect the collection while making it accessible, to preserve beauty while sharing it with a world that desperately needed reminders of what humanity could create instead of what it too often destroyed. The ethical dilemma kept Margaret awake too, pacing the second-floor hallway at 2 a.m. while Harold pretended to sleep, not wanting her to know he was as conflicted as she was. They'd been poor their whole lives. Not desperately poor, not suffering, but always careful, always worried about money, always making choices based on necessity rather than desire. They'd earned this. They'd risked everything to buy this house when everyone said they were foolish. They'd found the collection through their own curiosity and determination. They had every right to sell it and enjoy the rewards. But another part of them, the part that had been raised to value integrity over wealth, to believe in something larger than self-interest, whispered that maybe rights and obligations weren't the same thing. Maybe having the right to do something didn't make it the right thing to do. "What do you think we should do?" Margaret had asked one night, the two of them sitting on the sagging porch they'd finally rebuilt properly, watching stars appear over the mountains as darkness gathered. Harold had been quiet for a long time, thinking about Frederick Blackwood dying alone in a hospital, thinking about beauty locked in darkness for 40 years, thinking about what kind of people they wanted to be when this was all over. "I think," he'd said slowly, "we should find a middle path. Keep some pieces, the ones that mean something personal, the ones we could live with and enjoy, and share the rest. Loan them to museums, create a foundation like Marcus suggested, make sure people can see them without us losing everything we found." Margaret had taken his hand, squeezed it in the way that meant she agreed, that they were aligned, that they'd face whatever came next together. "That feels right," she'd said. "Hard, but right." "The right things usually are," Harold had agreed. The decision made, they'd met with Marcus Green and Dennis Porter and outlined their vision. A foundation that would own the collection, that would loan pieces to museums and galleries, that would ensure the art was preserved and accessible. Harold and Margaret would retain control during their lifetimes, take a modest salary for managing it, keep a few pieces for their personal collection. The rest would circulate through the world, beauty released from darkness, shared instead of hoarded. Marcus had drawn up the paperwork, navigated the complex legal and tax implications, structured everything to protect Harold and Margaret while honoring their wishes. The IRS had been involved, lengthy negotiations about valuations and tax implications, and whether the foundation structure was legitimate or just a scheme to avoid estate taxes. Agent Mitchell had worked with international authorities to verify provenance, to confirm that each piece had been legally acquired, that nothing needed repatriation. And slowly, grudgingly, over 6 months of constant pressure and challenge and threat, the legal framework had taken shape. The Blackwood Heritage Foundation, named to honor the man who'd built the collection even if his methods had been flawed, would hold the treasures in trust. Museums around the world would have access to pieces for exhibition, students would receive scholarships, restoration programs would be funded, and Harold and Margaret Sullivan, two elderly people who'd been mocked for buying a strange house, would ensure that beauty survived, that Frederick Blackwood's obsession had meaning beyond madness, that something good came from all the chaos. But the battle wasn't over. It was just beginning. The legal challenges continued to mount, each one requiring response, defense, endless paperwork and depositions and court appearances. The threats escalated. Someone broke in while they were in Asheville for meetings, trashed 2 rooms but didn't take anything from the vault, just made their anger known. The media attention intensified. National news picked up the story. Suddenly Harold and Margaret's faces were on television, in newspapers, their privacy completely gone. And through it all, they endured. They got up each morning, drank their coffee, worked on the house, attended legal meetings, gave statements to investigators, protected what they'd found with the same stubborn determination they'd brought to everything else in their lives. Some days Margaret cried from exhaustion and stress. Some nights Harold's heart condition flared, the atrial fibrillation that terrified both of them because it meant his body was protesting the pressure, warning him to slow down when slowing down wasn't an option. But they didn't quit, couldn't quit, because somewhere in the chaos, in the legal battles and threats and complications, they'd found purpose, found a reason bigger than themselves, found a way to take something broken, Frederick Blackwood's paranoid hoarding, and transform it into something healing, something that could bring beauty to people who needed reminders that the world held more than just struggle and pain. "We're going to make it," Sarah had said one evening, the three of them sitting at the kitchen table with legal documents spread between them, her voice fierce with certainty. "We're going to win." Harold had looked at his daughter, at this woman who'd become their champion, and felt pride swell in his chest. "I know we are," he'd said, because they had something their opponents didn't. They had each other. They had integrity. They had a reason to fight that went beyond greed or fear. And that, Harold had learned over 72 years of living, was usually enough. The complications would continue, the challenges would mount, the pressure would increase. But Harold and Margaret Sullivan had faced worse, had survived poverty and loss and every hard thing life had thrown at them. This was just another hard thing, and like every other hard thing, they'd get through it together. One day at a time, one decision at a time, one small victory at a time, until the battle was won and beauty was freed and Frederick Blackwood's legacy became something more than a vault in the darkness. It would become light. And that was worth any amount of complication, any amount of struggle, any cost they'd have to pay. They'd found treasure, yes, but more than that, they'd found purpose, and nothing that came at them could take that away. The legal resolution came on a gray morning in March, 18 months after Harold and Margaret had first descended those stone stairs into Frederick Blackwood's vault. They sat in a federal courthouse in Asheville, Marcus Green on one side, Sarah on the other, watching as Judge Patricia Hoffman reviewed the final settlement documents that had taken a year and a half to negotiate, that represented countless hours of depositions and hearings and mediation sessions that had cost them nearly $7 million in legal fees, but had been worth every penny because it meant the end of uncertainty, the end of wondering if everything they'd found would be taken away. Judge Hoffman was in her 60s, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, known for her fairness and her impatience with frivolous litigation. She'd presided over most of the consolidated cases challenging Harold and Margaret's ownership, had grown visibly irritated with opportunistic lawyers making claims based on speculation rather than evidence, had praised Marcus Green's meticulous documentation of provenance and legal acquisition for every piece in the collection. Now she looked over her reading glasses at the courtroom, at the handful of lawyers still representing the few remaining challengers, at Harold and Margaret sitting quietly with their worn hands folded, and delivered her final ruling. After extensive review of evidence, expert testimony, and applicable law, this court finds that Harold and Margaret Sullivan acquired the property located at 417 Blackwood Mountain Road legally and in good faith at a public auction. All items contained within said property, including the collection documented as the Blackwood Collection, are the legal property of the Sullivans by right of purchase and discovery. She'd paused. Let that sink in. Let the murmurs ripple through the courtroom. Further, this court finds no evidence of fraud, concealment, or illegal activity in the acquisition or subsequent management of said collection. The provenance documentation provided by the defense demonstrates legal acquisition of all items by Frederick Blackwood between 1967 and 1978. Claims of theft, looting, or illegal export are dismissed for lack of evidence. Another pause. The court acknowledges the extraordinary nature of this discovery, and commends the Sullivans for their decision to establish the Blackwood Heritage Foundation to ensure public access to the collection while maintaining proper preservation standards. This represents the kind of private stewardship that benefits society at large. She'd brought her gavel down with a crack that echoed like thunder, like finality, like freedom. All remaining claims are dismissed with prejudice. The Sullivans are the rightful owners of the Blackwood collection. This matter is concluded. Harold had gripped Margaret's hand so tightly his knuckles went white. Margaret had closed her eyes and breathed deeply for the first time in what felt like months. Sarah had wrapped her arms around both of them, and they'd sat there in the courtroom while lawyers packed briefcases and filed out, just holding each other, letting the relief wash over them in waves. It was over. The legal battle was over. They'd won. Outside the courthouse, reporters had gathered, cameras ready, microphones extended, questions shouting over each other in a cacophony of noise. Marcus had held up a hand, waited for relative quiet, and read a brief statement Harold and Margaret had prepared. Harold and Margaret Sullivan are grateful for the court's thorough and fair consideration of this matter. They're pleased that the legal uncertainty has been resolved and look forward to sharing the Blackwood collection with the world through the Blackwood Heritage Foundation. They have no further comment at this time and ask that their privacy be respected as they move forward with the important work of preservation and education. The questions had continued to fly, but Marcus had ushered them to a waiting car, and they'd driven away from the courthouse, from the cameras, from the chaos, back toward the mountains and the strange house that had become home, that had given them purpose, that had transformed their lives in ways they were still processing. In the car, Sarah driving, Marcus in the passenger seat, Harold and Margaret in the back holding hands like teenagers. They'd been quiet for a long time. Then Margaret had spoken, her voice soft but clear. "We need to do something for Pine Ridge, something big." Harold had nodded immediately, understanding without explanation. The town that had mocked them, that had called them foolish and senile, that had turned its back when they'd needed support. That same town was struggling, had been struggling for years, the lumber mill closing, young people leaving for opportunities elsewhere, Main Street half empty with shuttered stores and faded paint. They could have held a grudge, could have enjoyed their vindication, taken their fortune and ignored the people who'd dismissed them. But that wasn't who they were. That wasn't how they'd been raised, how they'd lived their lives, how they wanted to be remembered. "What are you thinking?" Sarah had asked from the front seat, watching them in the rearview mirror. "The community center," Margaret had said. "It's falling apart. The roof leaks, the heating barely works. They had to cancel the senior lunches last winter because the kitchen failed inspection. And the library," Harold had added. "They cut hours back to 3 days a week, can't afford staff or new books. Kids have nowhere to go after school." "The clinic," Margaret continued, warming to the idea. "Dr. Morris has been trying to keep it open, but he can't afford the equipment upgrades, can't get good nurses to stay because he can't pay competitive salaries." They'd looked at each other, this couple who'd spent their lives with barely enough, who'd just won the right to a fortune beyond imagination, and they'd smiled. Because they'd found the answer to the question that had been nagging at them since the discovery. What do you do with more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes? You share it, you help. You transform the place that shaped you, even if that place hadn't always been kind. "How much are we talking about?" Marcus had asked, his lawyer's mind already calculating tax implications and foundation guidelines. Harold had shrugged. "However much it takes, 10 million? 20? What's the point of having 400 million if we can't use it to help people?" Sarah had pulled the car over to the side of the mountain road, put it in park, turned to face her parents. Tears streamed down her face, not from sadness but from overwhelming pride, from seeing clearly the people who'd raised her, the values they'd instilled, the integrity they'd maintained even when it would have been easier to choose differently. "You're remarkable," she'd said, voice breaking. "Do you know that? You're the most remarkable people I've ever known." Margaret had reached forward, touched her daughter's face. "We're just ordinary people trying to do right. That's all we've ever been." But Sarah had shaken her head. "No, Mom. Ordinary people would take the money and run. Ordinary people would remember every slight, every insult, every person who laughed at them. You're choosing grace. That's not ordinary. That's extraordinary." The transformation of Pine Ridge began quietly. Harold and Margaret worked with Marcus to establish an endowment through the Blackwood Heritage Foundation, $25 million designated specifically for community development in their hometown. They met with the town council, with Mayor Hutchins, who'd ignored them at the auction 18 months ago, but now couldn't do enough to accommodate them, with community leaders who suddenly remembered that Harold had built half the buildings in town, that Margaret had sewn wedding dresses for 3 generations of brides. They listened to needs, to dreams deferred by lack of funding, to possibilities that had seemed impossible until now. The community center was first. They hired a regional architectural firm to design a complete renovation, keeping the original structure's bones but modernizing everything else. New roof, new heating and cooling, a commercial kitchen that met every code requirement, a gymnasium floor refinished to gleaming perfection, meeting rooms with updated technology, a senior center with comfortable furniture and activities space, a computer lab for kids who didn't have internet access at home. The project took 8 months and cost $3 million. Harold visited the site weekly, his carpenter's eye checking work quality. His presence a statement that this mattered, that he was invested not just financially but personally. The library received $2 million, enough to renovate the building, triple the book budget for 5 years, hire 3 full-time librarians, install computers and high-speed internet, create a maker space where kids could learn 3D printing and coding and other skills that might lead to careers in the new economy. Margaret donated her personal collection of vintage sewing patterns and fabrics, helped establish a textile arts program teaching traditional crafts to anyone interested. The clinic got $4 million, the most generous gift because health mattered more than anything else. They brought in medical equipment that let Dr. Morris provide services people used to drive an hour to Asheville for. They funded nursing scholarships for local young people who wanted to stay in Pine Ridge but needed education. They established a pharmacy assistance program for seniors who struggled to afford medications. They built an addition with space for visiting specialists, mental health counseling, physical therapy. Pine Ridge, which had been dying slowly for 2 decades, began to breathe again. But the physical improvements were just the beginning. The foundation established scholarship programs, full rides to college or trade school for any Pine Ridge student who wanted to continue their education. They funded small business grants, helping entrepreneurs start new ventures on Main Street, filling those empty storefronts with bakeries and bookshops and craft stores. They created an artist-in-residence program, bringing painters and writers and musicians to town for month-long stays, teaching workshops, enriching the cultural life of a community that had forgotten it could have culture. And slowly, almost miraculously, the town that had been hollowing out began to fill back in. Young people who'd left came back, drawn by opportunities that hadn't existed before. Retirees who'd considered moving away decided to stay. New families arrived, attracted by the quality of life, the sense of community, the knowledge that someone cared enough to invest in making the place better. Pine Ridge wasn't just surviving anymore, it was thriving, and everyone knew why. The change in how people treated Harold and Margaret was profound but complicated. The false friends disappeared once it became clear there was no personal fortune to access. Just a foundation with strict guidelines and professional management. The opportunists moved on to other targets. What remained were people who felt genuine gratitude, genuine shame for how they'd acted, genuine desire to make amends. Martha Henderson had been one of the first to apologize, really apologize, not with a casserole and a fake smile, but with tears and honesty. She'd appeared at their door 6 months after the legal victory, her face lined with something that looked like real regret. "Margaret, Harold, I was cruel," she'd said without preamble. "I judged you. I mocked you. I told other people you'd made a terrible mistake, and I took satisfaction in thinking I'd been proven right. And I was wrong, about everything, about the house, about your judgment, about who you are as people. I'm sorry, truly sorry. And I don't expect you to forgive me. I just wanted you to know I understand how badly I behaved. Margaret had looked at this woman who'd been part of her life for decades, who'd cut her hair and shared gossip and then turned away when Margaret had needed kindness. She could have closed the door, could have let Martha carry her guilt as punishment for cruelty. But she didn't. "Come in, Martha," Margaret had said. "I'll make coffee." They'd talked for 2 hours that afternoon, honest conversation about fear and judgment and how hard it is to support people when they make choices you don't understand. Martha had left with forgiveness, not easily given but genuinely offered, and had become one of Margaret's closest friends in the years that followed, relationship rebuilt on honesty rather than convenience. Buck Wilson had never apologized, had just nodded at Harold at Murphy's one day with something like respect in his eyes, and that had been enough. Some people couldn't say the words but could change their behavior, and Harold accepted that as sufficient. Father Kent had preached a sermon about the parable of the prodigal son, but twisted it, talking about communities that reject their own and are given grace they don't deserve, about how judgment returns multiplied while mercy transforms. Everyone had known he was talking about Harold and Margaret. The church had been full that Sunday, people who'd stopped attending coming back, and afterward dozens of folks had lined up to shake Harold and Margaret's hands, to say thank you, to acknowledge their own failures and the couple's extraordinary generosity. But Harold and Margaret didn't want gratitude, didn't want acknowledgement or praise or validation. They just wanted to do good work, to honor Frederick Blackwood's collection by making it accessible, to help their community because that's what you did when you had the ability to help. The vindication they'd found wasn't in people's changed attitudes. It was in the proof that their judgment had been sound, that buying the house had been the right decision, that trusting themselves when everyone else said they were wrong had led to something meaningful. "Do you ever think about what people said?" Sarah had asked one evening, the three of them sitting on the rebuilt porch, watching sunset paint the mountains in shades of fire. "About how you were wasting your money, throwing away your retirement." Margaret had thought about it, really considered the question. "Sometimes," she'd admitted, "but not with anger, more with sadness that people are so quick to judge choices they don't understand." Harold had nodded agreement. "The mockery never stopped us because we knew something they didn't. We knew what we were capable of, knew we'd survived worse than a risky investment, knew that even if we were wrong, even if the house was worthless, we'd still have each other, and that would be enough." He'd paused, watching the light fade. "But we weren't wrong. And that feels good, not because we get to say I told you so, but because it proves something important. That old people aren't used up. That poor people can have good judgment. That taking risks, real risks, with everything you have, sometimes that's not foolish. Sometimes that's the only way to find what you're looking for." Sarah had wiped her eyes, overcome by love for these people, her parents, who'd taught her more about dignity and integrity in the past year than she'd learned in the previous 40. "What were you looking for?" she'd asked. Margaret had reached for Harold's hand, held it the way she'd been holding it for 52 years now, anchor and comfort and home. "Purpose," she'd said simply. "We'd spent our whole lives working and raising you and just surviving. We wanted something more before we were too old to appreciate it. We wanted an adventure, a project, a reason to get up in the morning that felt important." "And you found it," Sarah had said. "We found it," Harold had agreed. "Just not in the way we expected." The Blackwood Heritage Museum and Education Center opened 2 years after the discovery, built on the property where the strange house stood, incorporating the original structure but adding a state-of-the-art exhibition wing designed by architects who understood how to display priceless art while maintaining climate control and security standards that would satisfy insurance companies and international loan agreements. The opening was a major event, attended by museum directors from across the country, art historians who'd spent careers studying the pieces now on display, collectors who'd searched for some of these works for decades, and hundreds of residents from Pine Ridge who'd watched the transformation with something between disbelief and pride. Harold and Margaret had insisted the opening be free to the public, that anyone who wanted could come see what had been hidden for so long. They'd given a brief speech, Harold's voice shaking slightly but his words clear, talking about Frederick Blackwood and his complicated legacy, about preservation and beauty and second chances, about how sometimes the most valuable treasures are the ones that get shared rather than hoarded. The museum became a destination, attracting visitors from around the world, bringing tourism revenue to Pine Ridge that revitalized the economy in ways the lumber mill never could have. Hotels opened, restaurants expanded, gift shops sold locally made crafts inspired by the collection. The town that had been dying found new life, all because two elderly people had been brave enough or foolish enough to buy a strange house everyone else avoided. But the museum was just part of the foundation's work. The scholarship program had sent 37 students to college in the first 2 years, kids who would have stayed in Pine Ridge working minimum wage jobs or left to find opportunities elsewhere but now had education and options and hope. The small business grants had launched 18 new ventures, employing over 60 people, filling Main Street with energy and possibility. The healthcare improvements had reduced emergency room visits by 40% because people could get preventative care, had increased life expectancy in the county by 2 years according to public health statistics, had made Dr. Morris cry when he realized he could finally provide the level of care his patients deserved. And the impact rippled beyond Pine Ridge. The Blackwood Heritage Foundation partnered with museums nationally and internationally, loaning pieces for exhibitions that brought beauty to communities that had no other access to world-class art. They funded restoration projects, helping preserve other collections that were deteriorating from neglect. They supported emerging artists, giving grants to young painters and sculptors whose work showed promise but who lacked the financial security to pursue their craft. They established an oral history project, documenting the stories of elderly craftspeople before their knowledge was lost, preserving techniques and traditions for future generations. Frederick Blackwood had spent his life hiding beauty, protecting it from a world he feared would destroy it. Harold and Margaret had taken what he'd hidden and released it into that world, trusting that beauty shared multiplied rather than diminished, that the risk of destruction was worth taking if it meant people could experience wonder, could be reminded of what human hands and hearts could create when given the chance. The impact on their family was perhaps the most personal transformation. Sarah had left her job in Asheville, become the executive director of the Blackwood Heritage Foundation, found work that felt meaningful in ways her corporate position never had. She'd moved back to Pine Ridge with Tom and the kids, bought a house 3 miles from Harold and Margaret, became part of the daily fabric of their lives again. Her children, Harold's grandchildren, grew up understanding that wealth was responsibility, that having more meant giving more, that their family's story was about courage and grace rather than luck or greed. They volunteered at the museum, gave tours to school groups, learned to see value in things beyond money. Harold's grandson, Benjamin, named for his great-grandfather, showed talent as an artist, spent hours sketching in the museum gallery, studying technique and composition. The foundation funded his art school education when the time came, but more than that, gave him access to mentors and inspiration that shaped his development in ways no amount of money alone could buy. Margaret's granddaughter Emma became fascinated with textile arts, learned traditional techniques from the programs Margaret had helped establish, won a national competition at 16 for a quilt that incorporated methods passed down through generations. She wanted to study textile preservation, to help museums maintain their fabric collections, to honor the kind of work her grandmother had done her whole life, but on a larger scale, connecting past and present. This was legacy, not just money passed down, but values, interests, passion for craftsmanship and beauty and helping others. Harold and Margaret watched their grandchildren grow, saw how the foundation's work influenced their worldview, shaped their ambitions, gave them a sense of possibility and responsibility that would serve them long after their grandparents were gone. "This is what it was for," Margaret had said one afternoon, watching Emma demonstrate quilting techniques to a group of seniors at the community center. Not the money, not the collection. This, the next generation carrying forward something meaningful. Harold, 81 years old now, his hands shakier but his eyes still sharp, had wrapped his arm around his wife of 55 years and pulled her close. "We did good," he'd said. "We really did good." The years had been kind to them in some ways, harder in others. Harold's heart condition had worsened, required medication and careful monitoring and occasional hospital stays that terrified Margaret every time. Margaret's arthritis had progressed, her hands more gnarled now, unable to thread needles anymore, but still able to hold Harold's hand, still able to gesture when she talked, still capable of the touch that had comforted and connected for more than half a century. They moved slower, tired more easily, took afternoon naps that had been unthinkable in their working years. But they were happy, genuinely, deeply happy in ways they'd never been before the house, before the discovery, before they'd learned that taking risks and trusting themselves and choosing grace over bitterness could transform not just their lives, but an entire community. People asked them sometimes, reporters doing follow-up stories or students working on school projects, what they'd learned from the whole experience, what wisdom they could share. Harold always paused before answering, wanting to get it right, wanting to distill 55 years of marriage and 81 years of life into something useful for people just starting out. "I learned that other people's opinions about your choices matter less than your own judgment," he'd say. "That being called foolish doesn't make you a fool. That age doesn't mean you're used up or incapable of adventure. That the biggest risks sometimes bring the biggest rewards, not in money, but in purpose and meaning, and the satisfaction of knowing you had the courage to try something everyone else was too scared to attempt." Margaret's answer was simpler, but no less profound. "I learned that kindness multiplies," she'd say. "That you can't control how people treat you, but you can control how you respond. That holding grudges hurts you more than them. That grace, real grace, transforms not just the people who receive it, but the people who give it. And I learned that love, real lasting love, makes everything else possible. Everything." They'd done interviews with national media, their story featured in magazines and documentaries and news programs that highlighted human interest stories. But they'd never gotten comfortable with attention, never stopped being essentially the same people they'd been before the discovery, still shopping at Murphy's General Store, still attending First Baptist on Sundays, still driving Harold's old truck that he refused to replace even though they could afford a fleet of new vehicles. Their house, the strange Blackwood house that had started everything, had been renovated and expanded but retained its odd character, its mismatched windows and inexplicable tower, its sense of being slightly out of step with normal architecture. They'd kept the hidden mechanisms, the buttons that opened the vault, occasionally taking trusted friends on tours down the stone stairs to show them where it all began, the steel door now propped open, the vault itself empty of treasures but full of history, preserved as part of the museum experience. "This is where our lives changed," Harold would tell visitors, standing in the fluorescent-lit space that had once held $400 million in art. "Right here. We could have walked away, could have been too scared to press those buttons, too cautious to descend those stairs. But we didn't. We chose curiosity over fear. And that made all the difference." On an autumn evening 7 years after they'd first bought the house, Harold and Margaret sat on their porch watching the sun set over mountains that had become more home than any place they'd ever lived. Sarah and her family were inside, making dinner, the sounds of cooking and laughter and normal life drifting through open windows. The museum was closed for the day, its parking lot empty, the treasures inside secure and silent until tomorrow when they'd be viewed by another group of students, another busload of tourists, another young person whose life might be changed by seeing beauty they'd never imagined existed. "Do you ever regret it?" Margaret asked, not because she thought Harold did, but because the question felt important to ask, to answer, to affirm after everything they'd been through. Harold thought about it seriously, reviewing 7 years of chaos and triumph and transformation. "Not once," he said, "not even during the worst of it, the threats and lawsuits and stress, because all of that led here, to this, to knowing we made a difference, that we helped people, that we did something that mattered." He squeezed her hand. "I regret plenty of things in my life. Words I didn't say, chances I didn't take, moments I can't get back. But buying this house, finding that vault, choosing to share what we found instead of hoarding it, no regrets, not a single one." Margaret leaned her head on his shoulder, feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence, the knowledge that whatever time they had left would be spent together, would be meaningful, would be enough. "We were brave," she said, not with pride, but with something like wonder, like she was still surprised by what they'd accomplished. "When everyone said we were foolish, we were actually brave." "We were," Harold agreed. "And the funny thing is, we didn't know we were being brave at the time. We just knew we wanted that house, wanted the project, the adventure, the possibility of something more. The courage came later, when we had to defend it, protect it, decide what to do with what we'd found. That's when we discovered we were braver than we knew." The light faded from the sky, stars emerging one by one, familiar constellations wheeling overhead the way they had for billions of years, indifferent to human drama, to treasure found and shared, to lives transformed. Inside, Sarah called them for dinner, her voice warm and domestic and perfect. Harold stood, his knees protesting, and helped Margaret to her feet, her arthritis making quick movements impossible, patience required for every transition. They walked inside together, arms linked, supporting each other the way they'd been supporting each other for 55 years, the way they'd support each other for whatever time remained, days or months or years. No one could know, but it didn't matter because they'd learned the most important lesson of all, that the quality of time matters more than the quantity, that what you do with your days defines you more than how many days you get, that leaving the world better than you found it, even in small ways, even in one town, even through one act of courage disguised as foolishness, that was enough. That was everything. That was the point. Harold and Margaret Sullivan had been mocked for buying a strange forest house with their last dollars. They'd been called senile and foolish and wasteful. They'd been dismissed and derided and written off as too old to make good decisions, and they'd been wrong about exactly none of it. Because beneath those rotting floorboards, hidden in a vault designed by a paranoid genius, they'd found not just $250 million in treasure, not just a fortune beyond imagination, but proof of something more valuable. That courage looks like ordinary people making extraordinary choices. That wisdom comes from trusting yourself when everyone doubts you. That dignity means choosing grace over bitterness, even when bitterness would be justified. And that the only way to truly possess beauty is to share it, to release it into a world that desperately needs reminders of what humans can create when we choose light over darkness, hope over fear, generosity over greed. They'd found a fortune and given it away, and in giving it away, they'd discovered they were richer than they'd ever been. Because wealth isn't what you keep. It's what you share, who you help, what you leave behind when your own time in this strange and beautiful world comes to its inevitable end. Harold and Margaret had learned that lesson, had lived it, had built a legacy not in money but in meaning, Not in possessions, but in purpose. Not in what they'd accumulated, but in what they'd given away. And that was worth more than any vault could ever hold. Because anyone can find treasure if they're brave enough to look where others won't. Anyone can change the world if they choose generosity over greed. Anyone can build a legacy that outlasts them if they remember what Frederick Blackwood forgot. That beauty meant to be hidden isn't beautiful at all. It needs light. It needs air. It needs eyes to see it and hearts to be transformed by it. As the years rolled on and Harold and Margaret grew older, frailer, closer to whatever ending awaited them, they knew their story would continue without them. The foundation would endure. The museum would remain. The scholarships would send generations of students into futures they couldn't have imagined without help. The town would thrive, would remember, would tell the story of the elderly couple who'd been mocked and dismissed and had responded with grace so profound it transformed everyone it touched. That was their legacy. Not the money, not the art, the transformation itself. The proof that choosing courage over fear, that trusting yourself when the world tells you you're wrong, that responding to cruelty with kindness and judgment with grace, those choices ripple outward in ways you can never fully measure, touching lives you'll never meet, inspiring people you'll never know, proving that ordinary people can do extraordinary things if they just have the courage to try. The end. Up next, 2 more powerful stories that will move you. Click to keep discovering with us. And don't forget to hit subscribe if you believe the bravest choice is always to trust yourself when everyone else doubts. If you believe that grace transforms more than revenge ever could, and if you know that sometimes the people called foolish are actually the wisest ones of all.